Many Victorian women smelled beautiful, while their bodies quietly went untouched for weeks. Beneath silk layers and polished manners lay a world where fragrance replaced care and scent became a mask stretched thin over exhaustion. Perfume hid rules, fears, and silent pressures no one dared mention aloud. What seemed elegant was often built on neglect so ordinary that society stopped seeing it. Tonight you will walk into that world with me and breathe what they once breathed. Before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly desires it. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If one stepped into the quiet routines of Victorian households, it became clear that modesty governed every aspect of a woman's life, even the parts no one was supposed to talk about. Cleanliness was not a matter of touching water or tending to the body. It was a matter of behaving in ways that aligned with an idea of virtue that had been repeated for generations. A woman's body was never just a body. It was a symbol, a fragile vessel expected to represent restraint, morality, and the boundaries of what society believed respectable. Anything that suggested familiarity with one's own skin was treated with suspicion, especially the act of bathing. Bathing seemed harmless in theory, yet it implied an intimacy with the body that many Victorians found unsettling. For women, the act of undressing, leaning over a basin, or stepping into a tub carried connotations that clashed with the era's insistence on modesty. Even in private, such a gesture risked crossing an invisible line. Mothers quietly taught their daughters to wash their faces and hands, but to avoid speaking of full baths unless necessary. Cleanliness, in the moral sense, was measured by silence and restraint rather than by water. The culture of the time encouraged a distance between a woman and her physical self. Respectability required a kind of detachment, as though acknowledging one's own body too openly was an admission of vanity or impropriety. Personal care was permitted only when performed quietly and sparingly, and preferably without anyone noticing. A woman who bathed too often risked being labelled self-indulgent or indecent. Rumours could spread from something as simple as a neighbour noticing water carried too frequently into a bedroom. Within this framework, perfume became the acceptable alternative. It allowed women to present a pleasant exterior without breaking the rules that prohibited intimacy with their own bodies. A few drops behind the ear, or dabbed onto gloves, created the illusion of cleanliness without requiring contact with water. It was not considered immodest to smell pleasant. It was considered elegant. And because perfume never required removing layers of clothing, it avoided the moral discomfort associated with bathing. The paradox grew more entrenched with each passing decade. While men could bathe without comment, women were told that water could weaken them, chill them, or disturb the delicate balance of their nerves. Newspapers promoted the idea that cold water was dangerous for female health. Some physicians even warned that frequent bathing might overstimulate the senses, leading women astray from discipline and virtue. These ideas, pseudoscientific but persuasive, aligned perfectly with the moral fears already embedded in society. Because the body was treated as something that needed to be concealed, hygiene concerns were often replaced with concerns about appearance. A woman did not need to be clean as long as she appeared refined. Layers of clothing, gloves, corsets, and long sleeves helped maintain the illusion. The scent of perfume, drifting softly from these garments, reassured others that the woman embodied propriety, regardless of what lay beneath the fabric. The body could remain untouched by water for days, yet a floral scent would persuade others that all was well. Families reinforced these beliefs through daily routines. Small basins were used for minimal washing, just enough to refresh the face and hands, nothing more. Full-body bathing required more time, more privacy, and more resources, all of which were viewed with suspicion or discomfort. Even women who wished to bathe more often found themselves constrained by expectations, judgment, or fear of being misunderstood. The social cost of appearing too attentive to one's body outweighed the physical discomfort of going without a proper bath. Perfume was convenient, affordable in small quantities, and socially encouraged. It carried no moral risk. It could be applied quickly and without fuss, allowing women to maintain an aura of grace while avoiding the scrutiny that might come from bathing. Merchants understood this and marketed perfume as a symbol of refinement rather than indulgence. The more strict the culture became, the more essential perfume seemed. In many households, bottles of perfume stood in plain sight on dressers, while bath supplies remained tucked away, rarely touched. Visitors would compliment the pleasant scent of a home or remark on the fragrance of a woman's gloves, never questioning the reality behind it. The scent acted as a veil, hiding not only physical odors, but also the unspoken rules that prevented women from truly caring for their own bodies. Seen from a modern perspective, this avoidance appears contradictory. A society obsessed with moral purity discouraged practices that would have actually contributed to health and cleanliness. It valued perfume not merely for its aroma, but for its ability to replace what many women were not permitted to do openly. The scent became a shield against judgment, a quiet method of survival within a strict social code. Women used it not because they lacked awareness, but because they lacked permission. Victorian morality shaped everyday decisions in ways that now feel strangely detached from practicality. Women learned to move through their days with careful restraint, balancing the expectations placed upon them with the discomfort of living in a body they were never fully allowed to acknowledge. The perfume they wore was not simply fragrance. It was compliance, adaptation, and evidence of how deeply social rules dictated personal choices. In the end, the pursuit of refinement became a kind of burden, one that demanded the suppression of basic needs in exchange for the appearance of virtue. The body remained quiet, hidden, and unattended, while its scent, manufactured and approved, spoke on its behalf. The pressure to uphold this moral image shaped even the simplest choices a woman made about her own body. Yet behind perfumes and layered clothing, another challenge silently narrowed their options. And from within those daily constraints, a different form of deprivation began to take hold in ways few fully recognized. Water scarcity shaped daily life in ways that left little room for comfort or choice, especially for women expected to maintain an appearance of refinement while living with the harsh reality of limited resources. In many Victorian neighborhoods, clean water did not flow from a tap or pipe. It arrived only when someone carried it, bought it, or waited long enough for a vendor to pass through the streets. Wells were unreliable, pumps were frequently contaminated, and public sources were shared by crowds whose needs far exceeded the supply. Even in cities, the promise of modern water systems rarely reached the people who needed them most. Families learned to ration water the way others rationed food. Each drop carried value, and each bucket demanded effort. Fetching water often required long walks, pushing through crowded alleys, or paying a few spare coins that most households could barely afford. The price could fluctuate with the weather, with shortages, or with the greed of those who controlled access to public pumps. For many women, simply obtaining water meant losing hours of the day in a routine that brought exhaustion more than relief. Because of this scarcity, the hierarchy of water use became rigid. Cooking and drinking were always placed first. Survival demanded nothing less. Washing clothes came next, though even that was limited, leaving garments worn repeatedly until the fabric held odors as stubbornly as memory. Personal washing, especially full-body bathing, was a luxury rarely granted the time, money, or water it required. The idea of using precious water for something as unnecessary as bathing felt indulgent in households struggling to meet their most basic needs. Within cramped rooms and narrow courtyards, water buckets sat guarded like valuables. The small amount collected each morning had to stretch across an entire day, sometimes longer. Dipping hands or a cloth into it was done sparingly, because once the water turned cloudy, it could no longer serve its essential purpose. And so women washed only what others could see. Hands and faces were kept presentable, while the rest of the body remained untouched by water for long intervals. The scarcity created a rhythm of living, in which appearance mattered more than actual cleanliness. For poorer districts, the situation was even more difficult. Shared pumps broke down often, and replacements took months. Some districts relied on carted water that was both expensive and questionably clean. Disease traveled easily through these supply chains, yet people had no alternative. Water arrived in barrels stained by previous contents, sometimes tar, sometimes oil, and even after being scrubbed, the taste remained faintly metallic or sour. But it was water, and that was enough. Bathing under such circumstances felt almost impossible. In winter, the struggle intensified. Water froze in pipes, pumps jammed with ice, and vendors charged higher prices due to scarcity. Households saved water in any container they could find, though freezing temperatures meant waking earlier each morning to break the thin crust of ice before boiling the day's supply. Using such hard-won water merely to bathe seemed unthinkable when meals depended on it. Urban families also faced the burden of overcrowding. Tenants living in the same building shared the same limited water sources, making privacy scarce and bathing even more impractical. Large households competed for access to the same narrow supply, and if someone decided to use extra water to wash their body, it often created quite a resentment among those who needed the same resource to cook dinner. Silent judgment became yet another barrier that discouraged bathing. Water scarcity also shaped expectations of women's behavior. A woman was expected to maintain dignity and refinement without relying on water to help her do so. Because water was expensive and difficult to obtain, other methods, perfume powders and carefully layered clothing, became acceptable substitutes. Society pretended this was elegance, when in truth, it was adaptation to deprivation. Women bore the burden of maintaining an image built on the illusion of cleanliness, rather than its reality. The scarcity fed into moral narratives as well. Those who bathed too often were quietly judged as wasteful or frivolous, especially if they lived in communities where people struggled even to secure enough water to boil vegetables. The pressure to appear modest, combined with the pressure to conserve resources, creating an unspoken rule: bathing was something one should not be seen doing, both for moral and practical reasons. And so infrequent washing became not only understandable but expected. In time, entire generations grew up believing that water belonged primarily in kitchens, not washrooms. The act of bathing, already burdened by moral concerns, now required a level of access and abundance most households never had. The result was a cultural acceptance of alternatives that masked the reality of limited water. People adjusted their behavior to the constraints around them, even when those constraints reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be clean. Through all of this, perfume and powders became more than adornments. They became solutions. They offered a way to live within scarcity while maintaining a facade of propriety. Water too rare to waste was replaced by scents strong enough to imply cleanliness without achieving it. And as the gap widened between appearance and reality, society simply adapted, pretending that fragrance could substitute for hygiene. These living conditions turned water into a guarded resource that shaped every decision a household made. Yet beneath this daily struggle lay another obstacle that pushed bathing even further out of reach. And in that quiet constraint, a different form of inconvenience began tightening its hold on women's lives. Private bathing facilities were a privilege reserved for only the wealthiest Victorian households, a quiet luxury hidden behind heavy doors and polished brass fixtures. For everyone else, the idea of stepping into a warm bath inside one's own home belonged more to imagination than to daily life. Most families lived in narrow rooms, stacked above one another, where space was constantly borrowed, shared, or improvised. In such places, privacy was fragile, and bathing became an activity negotiated rather than performed freely. For many women, the only available option was a small metal basin placed on the floor, barely large enough to sit beside, let alone inside. Heating water required fuel, effort, and time, three things most households lacked. The process of boiling water, carrying it across crowded rooms, and guarding it long enough to wash was exhausting before the bath even began. And once a woman started bathing, there was always the risk of someone knocking, entering, or needing to pass through the same cramped space. Cleanliness demanded exposure, and exposure was something few women could afford. Public bathhouses existed, but they were far from convenient. They were often located in distant parts of the city, forcing women to walk through streets crowded with vendors, factory workers, and strangers who watched too closely. Bathing there required money, which turned the simple act of washing into a financial decision. Inside, the atmosphere felt more like a necessity than a respite steam, mixed with the sounds of others rushing to finish attendance, calling out time limits, and the constant reminder that the water belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. Even when women made the journey, the environment offered little comfort. Public baths lacked warmth in both temperature and feeling. The floors were cold, the air damp, and the walls stained from years of use. The water, though technically clean, was shared through a system that recycled heat, but not necessarily purity. Bathing in such a place did not feel like care. It felt like a duty performed under the watchful eyes of strangers who had no interest in privacy. Within working-class homes, the absence of bathing rooms created household tensions that deepened the inconvenience. A basin placed in the center of a shared living area meant that anyone passing through had to avert their gaze or pretend not to notice. Family members learned to coordinate their movements in a delicate choreography, giving each other a semblance of privacy without ever truly achieving it. The more crowded the home, the more impossible bathing became. These limitations shaped habits quietly. Women washed only the parts that could be done quickly and discreetly. A cloth dipped in a bowl, replaced a full bath. A hurried rinse replaced what should have been a moment of reprieve. The expectation to appear clean remained, but the conditions to truly become clean were scarce. This gap between expectation and reality pushed women toward alternatives that did not require water space or privacy. While wealthy families installed porcelain tubs and decorative washrooms, poorer households struggled with routines that demanded constant compromise. A tub was not merely a piece of furniture. It symbolized a kind of dignity. Without it, bathing became an arrangement, a negotiation between convenience, shame, and necessity. And in such an environment, many women instinctively avoided bathing altogether, not out of disregard, but out of exhaustion and discomfort. The absence of a private space turned the simple act of tending to one's body into something risky and burdensome. Neighbors could overhear the sounds of splashing water or see steam rising from a window, and gossip spread easily in communities where everyone lived, tightly packed together. Even small acts of bathing risked becoming subjects of speculation, especially when tied to existing beliefs about modesty and morality. In this landscape, fragrance offered a solution that bathing could not. It required no tub, no heated water, no carefully arranged privacy. A few drops could conceal the body's reality and restore a sense of composure in a world where access to cleanliness depended as much on class as it did on water. Women adapted because they had to, not because they lacked understanding of hygiene. The absence of private bathing rooms forced them to find cleanliness through methods that avoided confrontation with the limits of their environment. Living with this shortage of space gradually altered how people perceived bathing as a whole. It shifted from a routine necessity to a disruptive event, something that had to be planned, debated, or postponed indefinitely. And once bathing became this complicated, other solutions, no matter how incomplete, began to feel not only acceptable but practical. In many homes, the basin remained untouched for days, while bottles of perfume were used daily without hesitation. The truth was not that people rejected bathing, it was that bathing rejected them. The infrastructure, the space, the privacy, and the time all worked against the possibility of washing in the way we understand it today. Under these conditions, perfume did more than mask scent. It provided a kind of stability in a world where fulfilling basic needs required navigating obstacles far greater than dirt or sweat. These cramped living conditions made bathing an ordeal that few households could manage with ease. Yet beyond the struggle for space, another fear lingered around the act of touching water itself. From within that quiet hesitation, something more troubling began to settle into women's daily decisions. Cold water carried a reputation that reached far beyond discomfort, shaping Victorian fears in ways that touched nearly every aspect of daily life. People whispered warnings about its dangers, believing that even brief exposure could weaken the body or invite illness. Women considered more fragile by the standards of the time were often told to avoid cold water altogether, especially during moments of exhaustion or emotional strain. These beliefs passed quietly from one generation to the next, settled into households with the weight of unquestioned truth. Bathing in this environment came to be seen as a medical risk rather than a hygienic necessity. A woman who washes herself while tired or chilled might be accused of recklessness. Neighbors and relatives repeated stories of women who collapsed after a cold bath or who fell ill after washing their hair on a damp day. No one questioned whether these tales were rooted in fact. Fear transformed them into warnings powerful enough to reshape behavior. The threat seemed especially real during the long Victorian winters. Homes were drafty fires, small, and warmth came at a cost. Cold seeped into every corner, making the thought of undressing for a bath unsettling even without superstition. Women were told that sudden exposure to cold water could disrupt the balance of their nerves, cause weakness, or trigger fainting spells. Physicians of the era, lacking modern understanding, sometimes reinforced these fears with vague statements that linked cold water to female constitution and nervous collapse. Under such beliefs, bathing was approached cautiously, as though it might betray the body at any moment. Many women preferred to stay wrapped in heavy clothing rather than risk touching cold water. The possibility of illness overshadowed any desire for physical comfort. Even warm water offered little reassurance. Heating it required fuel and time, and by the moment it was ready, the room might already be cooling again. The outcome felt unpredictable, and unpredictability fed fear. Within this anxious landscape, the idea of fragrance took on new importance. Perfume did not threaten the body. It demanded no exposure, no sudden temperature changes, no lingering dampness. It produced no shivers, no risk of chills, no suspicion of weakening the nerves. A woman could mask odors without inviting the dangers that people associated with bathing. The act of applying scent became a quiet form of self-protection, a choice shaped not by vanity, but by caution. Families encouraged this approach. Mothers advised daughters to avoid washing when fatigued or after emotional distress. Wives were told to rest, rather than bathe when returning from market errands. Even small tasks, such as rinsing one's feet at night, were approached with hesitation. The belief that cold water could shock the system lingered, especially in communities where stories of sudden illness spread quickly and were rarely challenged. The fear extended beyond simple caution. It altered perceptions of the body itself. Water was no longer a neutral element. It was a force that could invade, weaken, or unsettle. The line between self-care and self-harm blurred. Many women came to associate bathing with vulnerability rather than health, viewing cleanliness as something desirable yet dangerous. Such contradictions shaped daily decisions in subtle but lasting ways. This wariness influenced routines throughout the year. During summer, when water felt less threatening, women might wash more often, but only cautiously, and only when they believed their bodies were strong enough to handle the temperature change. During winter, bathing often stopped entirely. In these months, perfume and powders became indispensable companions. They allowed women to maintain an appearance of composure without challenging the beliefs that governed their environment. These fears were not merely personal. They reflected broader anxieties of a society grappling with disease, poor sanitation, and limited medical understanding. Illness was common in crowded cities, and people sought explanations wherever they could find them. Cold water became an easy target, especially when its effects were misunderstood or exaggerated. The connection between bathing and sickness felt intuitive to many, even though it was built on a foundation of misinformation and superstition. Women adapted by avoiding what they believed to be harmful. A basin of water left untouched spoke not of neglect, but of caution. A bottle of perfume used daily signaled practicality rather than indulgence. In this world, fragrance was not simply decoration. It was a safe alternative to a ritual that carried imagined risks. Perfume offered reassurance in a time when the body felt constantly at war with its surroundings. This mindset persisted because it fit neatly within existing moral frameworks. Avoiding cold water aligned with societal expectations of modesty and restraint. A woman who bathed too often risked both judgment and illness, while one who relied on perfume appeared sensible and controlled. The fears around water became part of a larger cultural pattern, one that dictated how women moved, dressed, cared for themselves, and interacted with their environment. By choosing fragrance over water, women protected themselves not only from supposed health dangers but also from social scrutiny. Their decisions reflected an intricate balance of belief, circumstance, and expectation, a balance that shaped their daily lives more deeply than they might have realized. These long-standing fears transformed water into something unpredictable and threatening within many households. Yet beneath these beliefs lay another force that quietly encouraged women to turn toward fragrance instead of cleansing. A quiet shift began to take hold, carrying with it consequences no one fully understood at the time. Perfume gradually became a requirement rather than an accessory, settling into Victorian life with a quiet inevitability. Even women who rarely touched water were expected to smell pleasant, as though fragrance alone could testify to their virtue. Cleanliness, once linked to physical care, shifted towards something symbolic, something performed for the comfort of others rather than for the body itself. A woman's scent came to function as a kind of public declaration, a subtle assurance that she belonged to a world that valued appearances above truth. It was understood, even if rarely spoken aloud, that not everyone had the means or conditions to stay clean. Crowded homes, scarce water, and limited privacy made full bathing almost impossible. Yet despite these challenges, the expectation remained a woman must not smell of sweat, fatigue, or the realities of her environment. Society allowed her to be tired, poor, or overworked, but it did not allow her to carry the scent of those burdens. Perfume disguised what life refused to accommodate. The pressure extended beyond practicality. Moral judgment rested heavily on a woman's body, and scent became one of the quickest ways for others to assess her character. A pleasant fragrance suggested discipline and purity. A natural odor, no matter how mild or unavoidable, was treated as evidence of lax morals or a lack of refinement. Many believed that bodily scents hinted at internal disorder, signs of indulgence, carelessness, or even moral decay. The link between smell and character grew so strong that women lived in constant awareness of how they might be perceived. In this atmosphere, perfume acted as a shield. It protected women from accusations without requiring them to change their difficult circumstances. A few drops on gloves, sleeves, or handkerchiefs created an aura of acceptability that carried them through crowded markets, narrow streets, and cramped rooms. The scent followed them like a practiced smile, smoothing over impressions that might otherwise lead to scrutiny or shame. Even those who disliked strong fragrances wore them out of necessity, understanding that a neutral body was rarely tolerated. The contradiction deepened over time. Women who labored all day were expected to smell as composed as those who spent their hours in drawing rooms. The standard allowed no variation, no acknowledgement of the body's natural functions. Perfume became not only a cosmetic choice, but a requirement for survival within a moral system built on contradiction. It imposed a form of silence on the body, muting its signals about health, fatigue, or stress. Fragrance covered everything: sweat, exhaustion, illness, until the truth became secondary to the impression. This emphasis on scent shaped entire routines. Women applied perfume before going outdoors, before receiving visitors, and even before entering rooms shared with family members. The body underneath the layers of fabric and fragrance grew increasingly ignored. Its needs were deferred, hidden, or treated as an inconvenience. Many women learned to live with discomfort rather than confront expectations that left no room for the physical reality of their lives. The more perfume was used, the less the body was noticed. Clothes absorbed the scent and released it throughout the day, giving the illusion of freshness, even when the skin beneath had not been washed for days. Powdered handkerchiefs and perfumed sachets tucked into sleeves reinforced this illusion. To outsiders, the fragrance signaled composure and order. To the women who relied on it, it was a reminder of how little control they had over their own bodies. The quiet tragedy of this reliance lay in its subtlety. No one intended harm by demanding pleasant scents. It was simply a cultural norm passed down and repeated until it felt immovable. Yet the effect was profound. Perfume created a barrier not only between the woman and society, but between the woman and herself. Her own body became something distant, something managed through layers of artificial scent rather than direct care. The fragrance she wore each day served as both a mask and a reminder of the distance between appearance and reality. In many ways, the body became secondary to the image it projected. The scent endured longer than the woman's own comfort. It lingered in rooms she left, on objects she touched, on clothing she removed at night. Meanwhile, the body beneath remained unattended, its needs overshadowed by expectations that granted no space for honesty. Perfume became the acceptable version of herself, the version that fit neatly into a society that demanded refinement, even from those who lived in conditions far from refined. What emerged was a strange paradox: a society obsessed with cleanliness, yet fearful of the practices that produced it. A society that judged women harshly while denying them the means to meet its standards. Perfume allowed this contradiction to continue, without resolution, offering a scent of purity where none existed. It was both a tool of survival and a symbol of how deeply women's bodies were misunderstood. This reliance on fragrance turned scent into a quiet substitute for genuine care, shaping how women navigated both their bodies and their reputations. Yet beneath this ritual lay a growing fascination with the expanding world of perfumes itself. What followed would deepen that fascination in ways no one fully anticipated. The 19th century brought with it a quiet yet unmistakable transformation in the world of fragrance. A shift that reached far beyond luxury and into the lives of ordinary women who had long relied on scent to replace the baths they maintenance could not take. Advances in chemistry introduced new methods of extracting, blending, and stabilizing aromas, turning perfume from a rare indulgence into something far more accessible. What once belonged only to aristocrats began to appear on the vanities of women across multiple social classes, carried there by a mixture of scientific progress, expanding markets, and the social expectations that perfume now helped fulfill. Laboratories in Europe filled with glass vials and unstable compounds experimented constantly with ways to harness scent more effectively. Chemists learned how to isolate aromatic molecules, create synthetic versions of expensive ingredients, and stabilize mixtures so they would linger longer on the skin and clothing. The results were fragrances more varied, more potent, and more affordable than anything seen before. This unseen scientific work, much of which occurred far from the public eye, changed the cultural landscape in subtle but lasting ways. France emerged at the center of this change. its growing fragrance industry, reshaping how people thought about perfume. Cities like Grasse expanded rapidly, becoming synonymous with the craft of blending scents from flowers, herbs, and resins. Workers harvested vast fields of jasmine, rose, and lavender, transforming them into concentrated oils shipped across Europe. Meanwhile, English manufacturers adopted similar techniques, building their own factories and producing perfumes aimed at the rising middle class. Competition between French and English producers intensified, driving innovation and lowering prices. As perfume became more available, it took on new roles in society. Bottles once ornate and precious became simpler and cheaper to produce, allowing merchants to sell fragranced oils, colognes, and scented waters to customers who had never been able to afford them before. Shops displayed dozens of options, each promising elegance, purity, or refinement in a form that required no water, no privacy, and no exposure of the body. Women who had grown accustomed to masking their physical realities found themselves with more choices than ever. With its growing availability, perfume no longer marked wealth alone. It marked conformity. Women used fragrance not merely to smell pleasant, but to signal their participation in a social code that demanded refinement, regardless of circumstance. The act of wearing perfume became woven into routines the way bathing once might have been. A few drops behind the ear, or on a handkerchief, were expected, especially in public spaces, where scent served as a kind of unspoken introduction. Industrialization played its part as well. Factories produced fragrances in quantities that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Synthetic ingredients replaced costly natural essences, creating perfumes that were both stable and inexpensive. For the first time, scent was something that could be purchased without sacrificing other essentials. A woman living in cramped quarters with limited access to water could still participate in the illusion of cleanliness that society demanded. Perfume became not only a cosmetic choice but a practical tool, a way to navigate daily life under conditions that made true hygiene nearly impossible. Marketing helped strengthen this shift. Advertisements portrayed perfume as a path to beauty, confidence, and social acceptance. Images showed graceful women, surrounded by flowers, their delicate fragrances drifting through elegant rooms. An ideal far removed from the crowded homes and narrow alleyways where many customers lived. The contrast between image and reality did not diminish the appeal. If anything, it heightened it. Perfume offered a taste of what women believed they ought to be, even if the rest of their lives bore little resemblance to those ideals. This growing industry also changed how society interpreted scent. Cleanliness became associated more with fragrance than with water. A woman who smelled of lavender or rose was assumed to be refined regardless of her actual circumstances. One who carried the odor of labor or the body faced judgment, even if she worked endlessly to provide for her family. Perfume created a dividing line, an invisible threshold separating those who appeared composed from those who could not afford the illusion. The rise of the fragrance industry deepened the reliance on scent as a substitute for bathing, reinforcing habits shaped by limited water access, moral constraints, and environmental conditions. Perfume became a daily necessity, its absence more conspicuous than its presence. Many women kept small bottles tucked in pockets or hidden among their clothing, reapplying throughout the day to maintain the appearance expected of them. The body beneath remained largely untouched, overlooked in favor of what others could perceive from a distance. Behind this cultural shift lay an uncomfortable truth. The perfume was not simply growing in popularity because it smelled pleasant, but because it helped conceal the consequences of inequality, scarcity, and rigid social norms. It allowed households to hide the strain of inadequate sanitation systems. It allowed women to navigate moral expectations without exposing their bodies to judgment. It allowed entire communities to pretend that the scent of flowers meant a kind of cleanliness they could not truly achieve. The industry flourished because the society it served demanded both illusion and discipline. Perfume fit neatly into both roles, offering a refined exterior without addressing the underlying conditions that made such masking necessary. Each new bottle sold was less a celebration of beauty than a quiet acknowledgement of how little control women had over the circumstances that shaped their lives. This expanding industry turned fragrance into a tool that reached far beyond luxury, embedding itself into the daily routines of women who relied on scent to meet impossible expectations. Yet alongside this growing accessibility came another influence, one shaped not by chemistry or commerce, but by the behavior of those at the top of society. Further changes began to stir, quietly, guided by the silent authority of those who set the standards others were expected to follow. Among the upper classes, perfume served a purpose that went far beyond masking the difficulties of daily life. It became a marker of distinction, a subtle but unmistakable sign that one belonged to a world insulated from the hardships faced by the rest of society. Wealthy women wore fragrances not out of necessity, but out of custom folding scent into their identity, the way they folded silk and lace into their wardrobes. Their perfumes drifted through drawing rooms, theatres, and carriages, reminding everyone who heard or smelled them that refinement could be signalled long before a word was spoken. Their clothing made fragrance even more essential. Layer upon layer of fabric, wrapped around the body, corsets, petticoats, underskirts, padded bustles, and embroidered gowns, creating an elaborate structure that allowed almost no breath of air to reach the skin. Changing these garments required time assistance and privacy, all things the upper class possessed, while simultaneously being constrained by the complexity of their dress. Sweat collected in hidden seams, trapped beneath tightly laced bodices. The garments themselves absorbed odour, easily holding it long after the body had cooled. Perfume, therefore, became an indispensable part of maintaining an image of effortless elegance. But these women did not simply wear scent. They defined which scents were desirable. Their preferences influenced the market, determining which fragrances became fashionable and which were quietly abandoned. Notes of violet, rose, bergamot, and amber, chosen by aristocratic tastes, filtered downward into commercial blends, eventually reaching households that had little in common with the salons and estates where such preferences were born. The upper class shaped the fragrance vocabulary of an entire era, often without realizing the extent of their influence. Servants and attendants absorbed this culture through proximity. They dressed their mistresses each morning, fastened gloves scented with sachets, arranged hair powdered with perfumed starch, and folded garments infused with oils. Even when they could not afford perfume themselves, they learned which scents signaled elegance and which suggested vulgarity. These impressions traveled with them as they returned to their own neighborhoods, carrying fragments of upper-class customs into the spaces where working families lived. In such quiet ways, perfume became not just an item of luxury, but a form of aspiration. Middle-class women striving to bridge the divide between their lives and those they admired adopted perfume with growing enthusiasm. They could not match the wardrobes or estates of the wealthy, but they could imitate their scent. A bottle of perfume became an affordable symbol of participation in a social hierarchy that often felt rigid and unreachable. Advertisements reinforced this hope, showing images of noble women framed by flowers and implying that a single bottle could offer access to a world defined by grace and respectability. For many, this illusion carried real emotional weight. As the habit spread, fragrance took on new social significance. Wearing perfume signaled an awareness of fashion manners and propriety. Not wearing it could be interpreted as ignorance, indifference, or carelessness. The upper class, knowingly or not, established these invisible expectations. Their public presence at balls in parlours and walking through parks created models of behaviour that others felt compelled to follow. Even those who lived in cramped quarters or laboured long hours found themselves drawn into the expanding culture of scent, adopting refined fragrances to counteract the realities of their environment. Clothing styles reinforced this shift. Middle-class garments, though simpler than aristocratic dress, remained thick, structured, and difficult to launder. Layers remained a constant challenge, trapping heat and odour just as efficiently as the gowns worn by wealthier women. Perfume became the simplest solution to a problem no one wished to acknowledge openly. As scent travelled downward through society, it brought with it a sense of continuity, a shared agreement that fragrance could stand in for cleanliness, composure, and status. The influence of the upper class also shaped the emotional meaning attached to perfume. Their scents carried connotations of leisure, gentility, and control qualities rarely available to working women. To smell like the wealthy was to feel briefly removed from the pressures of survival, even if only in imagination. Fragrance created a temporary shift in identity, allowing women across different classes to inhabit a version of themselves that felt more dignified, more graceful, more socially acceptable. This aspiration, however, carried an undercurrent of restraint. Women used perfume not simply to emulate the wealthy, but to avoid the judgments that came from failing to do so. Scent became a requirement as much as a desire. A woman who smelled of labour risked being associated with moral or intellectual deficiency, regardless of how hard she worked or how limited her circumstances were. The standards set by the upper class placed expectations on women who lacked the resources to meet them, fully reinforcing a cycle in which fragrance masked the inequalities that shaped daily life. The upper class rarely confronted the consequences of its influence. Protected by wealth, they did not consider how their habits would affect women who lived with limited water, crowded homes, or physically demanding work. They enjoyed fragrance as an adornment, a pleasure, a symbol of taste. For others, perfume became a necessity, born from constraint shaped less by luxury than by survival. The disparity remained unseen, woven quietly into the fabric of society. By the end of the century, fragrance had become a cultural norm across social boundaries, solidifying a standard initiated by those who had never struggled with hygiene or space. Their choices set expectations that rippled through households far outside their own, creating a world in which scent served as both aspiration and camouflage. This diffusion of upper-class habits transformed perfume into a widespread marker of respectability, shaping how women across society presented themselves each day. Yet, as scent became more deeply embedded in daily routines, another idea began to take hold, one that redefined what it meant to be considered clean. Interpretations of cleanliness shifted quietly, guided by beliefs that valued fragrance over the realities of the body beneath. As perfume filtered deeper into Victorian life, the meaning of cleanliness itself began to shift. People no longer understood cleanliness as something achieved through water soap or the deliberate care of the body. Instead, they learned to associate it with absence, the absence of unpleasant odors, the absence of visible dirt, the absence of anything that might hint at the realities of human flesh. Fragrance became a form of olfactory disguise, a way of performing purity rather than embodying it. Women who wore perfume were regarded as clean, regardless of whether their bodies had touched water in days. This change in perception took hold gradually, reinforced by everyday routines and the environment in which people lived. Bathing remained rare, difficult, or inconvenient for many, but smelling pleasant was achievable even under strained circumstances. A scented handkerchief, a dab of floral water or powder sprinkled across clothing, created the suggestion of freshness. The body beneath could remain untouched by water without attracting judgment. Cleanliness became a matter of perception rather than hygiene. In this redefined world, scent functioned as a stand-in for washing. People spoke of fragrance as though it carried the power to cleanse, restore, or protect. Women dusted themselves with powders containing lavender or violet, and believed these actions fulfilled the expectations of propriety. To smell good was to be considered presentable, even respectable. Few questioned the logic. It was easier to accept a perfumed illusion than confront the structural obstacles that prevented genuine cleanliness. The belief that fragrance could replace bathing gained further strength from social expectations. A woman needed to appear composed and refined, no matter her circumstances, and perfume provided a convenient way to achieve that appearance. Bathing required time, water, privacy, and warmth resources not readily available. Perfume required only a small bottle and the willingness to conform. This contrast made fragrance seem practical, almost rational, especially in households where maintaining a respectable image mattered more than the body's internal comfort. Society reinforced this shift in subtle ways. Compliments were directed at pleasant scents rather than clean bodies. A woman entering a room trailed by a soft floral aroma was praised for elegance, even if she had not bathed recently. Meanwhile, any hint of natural odor, even one caused by hard work or the environment, invited quiet criticism. The body's natural state became something to hide, while artificial fragrance became a symbol of social competence. This preference extended into daily interactions. People drew closer to those who smelled pleasant, assuming refinement and propriety in the faint traces of rose or bergamot. Perfume shaped impressions, altering how women were treated and how they treated themselves. The more fragrance stood in for cleanliness, the more deeply rooted the idea became that scent mattered more than the body itself. Women monitored their perfume with the same vigilance that others monitored their appearance, reapplying when they feared the aroma had faded. The phenomenon revealed a subtle hierarchy. The body was physical, while perfume was social. Bathing belonged to the private realm associated with the messiness of flesh and the vulnerability of exposing one's own skin. Perfume belonged to the public sphere. It communicated refinement, restraint, and self-awareness. Even the act of applying it felt detached from the body, performed while fully clothed without the intimacy or labor that bathing required. Cleanliness became performative, directed outward rather than inward. Within this framework, women became experts in managing perception. They learned to navigate rooms in ways that allowed fragrance to precede them, masking whatever truth lay behind the layers of fabric. Many developed routines that kept their bodies mostly untouched by water, while ensuring their scent remained carefully maintained. This approach allowed them to fulfill expectations without challenging the beliefs that shaped their lives. The environment reinforced the need for such adaptations. Crowded cities offered little opportunity for privacy, and shared living spaces rarely accommodated bathing. Water, when available, was often cold or contaminated. Given these constraints, perfume appeared not as a luxury, but as a necessity. It allowed women to participate in societal rituals of cleanliness without confronting the realities of their surroundings. Fragrance filled the gap between expectation and possibility. Perfume also provided emotional reassurance. Women who felt uneasy about their unwashed bodies found comfort in the scent that surrounded them. It gave them the feeling, however fleeting, of being put together, of meeting the standards imposed upon them. This comfort was not insignificant. In communities where reputation mattered deeply, fragrance acted as protection, offering a shield against judgment and suspicion. Over time, this shift created an unspoken agreement across society. To smell clean was to be clean. People rarely questioned this replacement of physical hygiene with olfactory camouflage. It became an accepted truth, woven into daily routines and reinforced by social norms. Perfume turned into a silent mediator between the body's needs and society's expectations. The consequences of this new understanding of cleanliness extended far beyond individual habits. It shaped how women approached their own bodies, how they invested their resources, and how they navigated social spaces. Fragrance became a currency, allowing those with limited means to project an identity that required neither bathing nor luxury. Yet the reliance on scent also distanced women further from acknowledging their physical reality. The body grew quieter, hidden beneath the layers of fragrance and cotton. This cultural shift shed light on the broader contradictions of Victorian society, a world that demanded refinement but created conditions hostile to its pursuit. People clung to perfume not only because it offered an easy solution, but because it aligned with their need to maintain dignity in environments that rarely supported it. This reframing of cleanliness turned fragrance into a substitute for genuine care, shaping expectations in ways few questioned. Yet beneath these shifting beliefs lingered another pressure, one tied less to practicality and more to the ideal of perfection imposed upon women. Changes in appearance and behavior soon became another battlefield where scent played a defining role. Victorian society placed an extraordinary weight on women, demanding that they embody an image of effortless grace no matter the circumstances around them. Appearance and demeanor became obligations rather than choices, each detail scrutinized by a culture that believed femininity required a constant state of composure. A woman was expected to move, gently speak, softly, and present herself as though untouched by the physical realities that shaped her daily life. In this world, even the slightest hint of exertion, sweat, fatigue, or scent threatened to break the illusion she was required to maintain. This pressure emerged not from practicality, but from a deeply rooted belief that women existed partly for public consumption. Their bodies were treated as symbols of virtue, restraint, and domestic order. A woman's appearance reflected not only her personal character, but also the status and discipline of her family. Any sign that she had engaged in physical labor or endured discomfort risked exposing the fragile boundary between idealized femininity and the truth of everyday existence. As a result, women learned to hide the evidence of their bodies as carefully as they hid their private thoughts. Sweat in particular became something unmentionable. It signaled activity, warmth, and effort, qualities associated with labor, not refinement. Even in sweltering summers or crowded rooms, women were expected to remain outwardly serene, their dresses heavy, their posture graceful, their scent floral. The human body's natural responses were treated as intrusions, reminders that beneath layers of fabric and etiquette lay something raw and physical. The fear of revealing this truth shaped how women moved, how they dressed, and how they endured their environment. Perfume stepped in to maintain the illusion. It offered a way to bypass the demands of the body without confronting the conditions that caused discomfort. A delicate scent suggested control, calmness, and refinement, even when the reality beneath the gown was far less composed. Women relied on fragrance not because they wished to deceive, but because society required them to present a version of themselves untouched by physical exertion. The more tightly constrained their lives became, the more indispensable the fragrance grew. Clothing reinforced these expectations. Many garments were designed less for comfort than for presentation: corsets that restricted breathing, skirts that weighed heavily and trapped heat, and gloves that limited touch. These layers prevented women from moving freely, yet required them to appear graceful within those restrictions. The fabric held sweat close to the skin, intensifying discomfort while simultaneously hiding the signs of strain. Under such constraints, perfume became both a necessity and a signal, a way to mask the physical toll exacted by clothing that was never meant to accommodate human needs. This ideal extended into social interactions. Women learned to occupy space with careful restraint, avoiding any gesture that might reveal effort or exertion. They walked slowly to prevent perspiration, avoided bending or lifting in public, and concealed fatigue behind measured expressions. These subtle performances shaped their days and nights, creating a lifestyle built around the maintenance of an image. Even breathing had to appear controlled. Anything less risked suggesting a loss of poise. The expectation to remain fragrant at all times added another layer of pressure. A woman who carried the faintest trace of bodily scent risked judgment regardless of how difficult her living conditions might be. In crowded cities where water was scarce and bathing facilities limited, this expectation bordered on impossible, yet the standard persisted. Women feared that the natural smell of their bodies might betray them, exposing the gap between social ideals and personal realities. Perfume, inexpensive and increasingly common, became a lifeline. Middle-class women were caught in a particular bind. They lacked the luxuries enjoyed by the wealthy, yet were expected to mimic the same standards of refinement. Their days included work, household duties, and errands through polluted streets, leaving them little time or freedom to maintain the illusion of delicacy society demanded. And yet the expectation held firm. They must appear composed, untroubled by labor, and fragrantly clean, even when their living environments allowed little opportunity for true hygiene. The contradiction became even sharper for working women. Factories, markets, and shops demanded physical effort, leaving workers sweating under layers of restrictive clothing. Still, the requirement to smell pleasant, impossibly pleasant, clung to them. A woman who failed to meet this expectation faced whispers and assumptions about her character. Bodily odors, natural consequences of labor, were treated as personal failings. Scent thus became not just a mask but a shield against moral judgment. Through all this, the idea of the perfect woman persisted. Delicate, graceful, ever fragrant, untouched by the complications of her own body. This ideal was never achievable, yet society clung to it fiercely, reinforcing it through literature, etiquette manuals, and casual conversation. Women internalized these expectations, shaping their routines around maintaining a facade that left little room for authenticity. Perfume became one of the few tools that allowed them to meet these demands without exposing the compromises hidden beneath. Over time, the pressure to present an idealized version of femininity eroded the distinction between appearance and identity. A woman who smelled of flowers was assumed to be gentle and refined, even if her life was marked by hardship. One who failed to maintain the illusion risked harsh judgment regardless of her circumstances. The reliance on scent thus became both a symptom and a symbol of the broader constraints shaping women's lives. These expectations transformed fragrance into a quiet weapon against judgment, helping women preserve an image they were never permitted to abandon. Yet behind this facade, chemical dangers hid in the very scents meant to protect them. As these risks emerged, the illusion of safety surrounding perfume began to fracture in unsettling ways. Victorian women reached for their perfume bottles with a kind of trust that seems almost fragile when viewed from the distance of another century. The glass looked delicate, the labels elegant, and the liquids inside shimmered with colors that promised purity, calmness, and refinement. No one questioned what lay beneath those promises. The ingredients were invisible, and invisibility often creates the most dangerous kind of confidence. Women dabbed fragrances onto their wrists, behind their ears, along the edges of their necks, unaware that the substances soaking into their skin were far from harmless. Many perfumes contained heavy metals, though no one used that term at the time. Lead appeared in powders and scented creams. Mercury slipped into skin lotions and floral waters, its shimmer mistaken for beauty. Arsenic ground into fine dust, brightened powders, and deepened the whiteness prized in cosmetic blends. These materials, now recognized as hazardous, circulated freely through markets and parlors. Their presence was not a secret, yet few understood the danger. The beauty industry of the era worked without regulation, guided more by tradition and rumor than by science. Scented lily extracts, considered the height of purity and femininity, sometimes caused women to faint. Their fragrance was potent, dense, and cloying, creating a cloud that overwhelmed the senses. Yet, fainting was interpreted not as a sign of toxicity, but as a symbol of a delicate nature. Society preferred an aesthetic interpretation to a medical one, choosing beauty over caution again and again. Perfume manufacturers saw no reason to adjust their formulas. The public, enchanted by the association between scent and virtue, continued to buy. The irony is stark: women who feared the natural smell of their own bodies willingly covered themselves with chemicals far more harmful than anything they tried to hide. Their fear did not come from ignorance alone, but from expectations so deeply planted that deviation felt sinful. A woman who did not smell pleasant risked moral condemnation. A woman who fainted from perfume risked nothing more than attention. The world favored the latter. Perfume application itself carried its own rituals. Women dabbed it onto pulse points, believing heat would release the fragrance gradually. They sprinkled scented powders beneath their clothing, letting the odor rise slowly throughout the day. These intimate practices created prolonged exposure. Each breath they took contained traces of metals and solvents. Each hour allowed more toxins to sink into their skin. The danger grew silently, accumulating in their bodies without their knowledge. Working women faced additional risks. Their perfumes, often cheaper, contained even harsher ingredients: adulterated solvents, unidentified oils, and powders mixed with fillers that carried contaminants. Markets and small shops offered fragrances at every price level, but inexpensive options were more likely to include dangerous substitutes. Yet these women had no real choice. Scent was not optional. It was a requirement of respectability. To smell neutral or human was unacceptable. To smell artificial, even dangerously so, was expected. The belief that perfume protected one's health made the danger harder to recognize. Some fragrances were marketed as disinfectants, supposedly capable of purifying the air and preventing illness. In a society frequently threatened by epidemics, these claims felt reassuring. People bought scented sachets to place in their clothing, believing the aroma could repel disease. They carried small vials in public spaces and breathed deeply, unaware that the inhaled vapors could damage their lungs or disrupt their nervous system. Fear of sickness drove them toward the very substances that endangered them. Physicians occasionally raised concerns, but their warnings were quiet and scattered. Their voices struggled against the stronger forces of fashion, commerce, and tradition. Even those who suspected harm lacked the tools to measure or prove it. Analytical chemistry was young, and medical understanding was limited. Without proof, suspicions faded quickly. Women, meanwhile, continued to perfume their bodies with substances that accumulated silently in their systems. Some symptoms were visible, such as persistent headaches, tremors, fatigue, and irritability, but these were rarely linked to fragrance. Society attributed them to nerves, to delicate constitutions, to the weight of social expectations. Women themselves accepted these explanations, believing their discomfort resulted from emotional strain rather than chemical exposure. So the cycle continued, each application deepening the invisible harm. The paradox grew sharper, as perfumes became symbols of refinement. To wear them was to demonstrate self-control, discipline, and adherence to social norms. Yet beneath that surface lay a creeping vulnerability, bodies weakened by substances chosen in pursuit of perfection. Women masked their natural scent and unknowingly their health. Society rewarded the appearance of fragility, yet ignored its cause. These dangers did not remain confined to perfumes alone. They seeped into powders, soaps, creams, and even the tools used for grooming. Dressing tables with their neatly arranged bottles and brushes became quiet stages where beauty and poison coexisted. Women moved through their routines without knowing they were participating in a ritual with consequences far more lasting than a fleeting floral note. Still, perfume remained irresistible. It was one of the few forms of expression available to women in a world that restricted them. Fragrance allowed them to craft an identity, even if that identity came with hidden costs. The contradiction defined an era beauty, intertwined with danger, refinement built on fear, and the pursuit of acceptance, paved with substances that eroded the very bodies meant to be admired. By the time awareness began to grow, The cultural dependence on fragrance was already deeply rooted. Women could not simply discard perfume. It had become inseparable from femininity itself. The cost of abandoning it socially, emotionally, and personally felt too high, even as the physical cost continued to rise silently. This reliance on hazardous fragrances exposed how deeply society prioritized appearance over well-being, binding women to a dangerous ritual they believed necessary. Yet behind these bottles and powders lay everyday realities just as troubling, hidden not in chemistry, but in the clothing women could not easily clean. Pressure to conceal the truth of worn, unwashed garments soon shaped another layer of dependence on perfume. Victorian clothing created a burden few modern observers can fully imagine. The gowns were heavy, multi-layered, and constructed with fabrics that resisted easy cleaning. Dirt clung to them, sweat seeped into them, and odors settled deep within their folds. Yet washing these garments posed risks that extended far beyond inconvenience. Women wore clothing designed for display rather than practicality, garments that transformed the simple act of laundering into a physically demanding, sometimes dangerous undertaking. Most dresses contained steel or whalebone supports that distorted the natural shape of the body and complicated the cleaning process. Water could warp the frames, weaken threads, or cause dyes to bleed unpredictably. Even if a woman possessed the strength and space required to soak such garments, doing so risked ruining them entirely. For families without wealth, damaging a dress meant losing one of their most valuable possessions. The fear of destruction hovered constantly, shaping how and how often clothing could be washed. Laundry itself was laborious and physically taxing. Water needed to be fetched, heated, hauled, and managed with care. The sheer weight of wet Victorian fabric could strain a woman's arms and back. Many washing areas lacked ventilation, increasing the danger from boiling water steam and cramped working spaces. Burns, slips, and collapsed drying structures were common accidents, especially for those attempting to wash dresses never meant to endure such handling. Laundry was not a chore, it was an ordeal. Because of this, clothing was rarely washed thoroughly. Instead, garments were brushed, aired, or wiped, but these methods could not remove the odors trapped within multiple layers. A dress worn for an entire season might only be fully washed once or twice. Undergarments, though washed more often, still carried the residue of sweat and daily wear. Even in well-to-do households, full laundering remained infrequent due to risk expense and the fragility of the clothing. Working women faced harsher limitations. Their garments absorbed dust, smoke, and sweat throughout long days, yet they lacked the resources to maintain them properly. Water access remained inconsistent, soap expensive, and private spaces for washing scarce. They wore the same dresses repeatedly until the fabric grew stiff with accumulated grime. Society judged them for this, without acknowledging the structural barriers that made regular cleaning nearly impossible. Drying clothing posed another challenge. Heavy garments required long hours in the open air, yet many families lived in cramped neighborhoods with limited outdoor space. Damp clothing hung, trapping moisture in crowded rooms, creating musty smells that clung to walls, bedding, and skin. Even freshly cleaned garments could acquire unpleasant odors simply from the environment in which they dried. Perfume entered this cycle not as a luxury, but as a survival tool. It masked the smell of clothing that could not be washed, and bodies that could not be bathed. Women sprinkled fragrance onto collars, cuffs, and linings. They stored scented sachets between layers of fabric and dabbed aromatic oils onto handkerchiefs they tucked into sleeves. These efforts did not eliminate odor. They layered something more socially acceptable on top of it. The expectation to appear clean despite these hardships intensified reliance on scent. Odor became a social liability, interpreted as evidence of poor hygiene or moral failure. Yet the physical conditions of Victorian life made odor unavoidable. Heavy fabrics, limited water access, poorly ventilated homes, and long hours of labor all contributed to the problem. Perfume became the quiet answer, an attempt to reconcile societal demands with material realities. Even the wealthy, though, spared the physical labor of washing faced similar issues. Their elaborate gowns required servants to handle the cleaning process, but the risks remained the same. A single mistake could destroy a costly garment, so washing was minimized. Instead, wealthy households embraced perfumed wardrobes, storing dresses with sachets, spritzing hems, and maintaining scented drawers. Their clothing smelled pleasant, but the fragrance disguised the truth more than it transformed it. Because laundry occurred so infrequently, odors built up slowly and subtly. A woman might notice the lingering smell of perspiration beneath her corset, or the faint scent of dust settling into her skirts. Unable to remove these entirely, she turned to fragrance as a practical remedy. The perfume did not signal indulgence. It signaled adaptation. Each gesture of application was a quiet acknowledgement that her clothing, like her environment, resisted cleanliness. The connection between scent and fabric deepened over time. Clothing stored in scented spaces carried fragrance into the streets and parlors, creating a cloud that preceded the wearer. People interpreted this as refinement, unaware that it hid the limitations imposed by fabric and circumstance. Women, especially those conscious of their social standing, relied on this association to maintain dignity in environments that undermined it daily. This practice shaped personal identity in subtle ways. Women became curators of their own aroma, building layers of scent meant to present an idealized version of themselves. Their clothing, heavy with unwashed memories, became canvases for the fragrances they applied. In this strange blend of concealment and expression, perfume served as both a mask and a narrative, one that allowed women to navigate judgment with a semblance of control. Over time, the reliance on fragrance reinforced the belief that smelling clean mattered more than being clean. This distinction, subtle at first, became a defining feature of Victorian hygiene culture. Women adjusted their routines to fit the demands of fabric water scarcity and societal expectations, even as their clothing grew heavier with the weight of unwashed days. The more burdensome the clothing became, the more essential perfume felt. The sweet floral or powdery notes that drifted from their garments did not reflect reality, but resisted it, an insistence that appearance could overcome truth. These constraints made fragrance an unavoidable companion, a quiet tool that softened the harshness of garments too difficult to clean. Yet hidden beneath this dependence on scent lay deeper misconceptions, beliefs about health, and the body that shaped how women understood danger itself. Shifts in medical thinking would soon blur the line between caution and misunderstanding in unsettling ways. Medical authority carried immense weight in Victorian society, yet the guidance physicians offered often reflected superstition, incomplete science, and cultural bias more than genuine understanding. Their advice shaped household routines, personal habits, and the ways women interpreted their own bodies. In that era, many doctors warned against frequent bathing, insisting that too much exposure to water, especially cold water, could weaken the nerves, drain vitality, or leave the body vulnerable to illness. Rather than seeing cleanliness as a safeguard, they viewed it as a potential threat. These warnings stemmed partly from the limited knowledge of physiology at the time. The human body remained a mystery, and theories about health often rested on intuition rather than evidence. Physicians observed that patients weakened by illness sometimes reacted poorly to cold water, and from this they generalized, improvised conclusions. Bathing fatigued the body, bathing disrupted balance, and bathing exposed the flesh, danger. The distinctions between correlation and causation blurred easily, creating a medical culture suspicious of water and protective of the body's warmth. Women already burdened by social expectations bore the brunt of this misguided advice. Doctors believed female bodies were especially fragile, prone to collapse or emotional instability if exposed to sudden changes in temperature. Warm baths were considered risky, cold baths were nearly unthinkable. Physicians recommended sponge baths, or gentle wiping instead, advising households to avoid practices that might shock the system. These recommendations align neatly with existing social norms, reinforcing the belief that bathing was dangerous or improper. At the same time, natural body odor carried a surprising degree of legitimacy in medical thinking. Rather than interpreting sweat or scent as evidence of poor hygiene, some doctors viewed these as indicators of internal balance. The smell of the body was believed to reflect diet, temperament, or emotional state, acting as a kind of biological signature. If a person exuded a mild, natural scent, it was thought to demonstrate health. Eliminating or overpowering this scent through bathing or excessive washing risked disrupting what was considered a healthy equilibrium. This perspective seemed convenient in a society where bathing remained difficult, expensive, or impractical. By declaring natural odor a sign of vitality, physicians effectively normalized the challenges of hygiene. Their advice reassured households that infrequent bathing did not reflect negligence, but practicality. For women, the message was clear: to preserve health, one must avoid extremes: too much heat, too much cold, too much exertion, too much water. Moderation became the rule, even when that moderation veered into avoidance. Perfume entered this landscape quietly positioned, not as a cosmetic indulgence, but as a therapeutic tool. Many physicians encouraged its use to calm nervous dispositions, soothe headaches, or lift melancholic moods. Scents like lavender, rose, and bergamot were believed to influence the mind, offering relief from tension or emotional distress. Aromatic sachets were placed near pillows to ease sleep. Vials were carried in pockets to counter faintness. Perfume became an unofficial medical recommendation woven into daily life as a means of emotional regulation. The absence of regulated pharmaceuticals contributed to this reliance on scented remedies. In an era before standardized medicine, households depended on whatever seemed to offer relief. If a few drops of perfume or floral water created a sense of calm, that effect was embraced. The boundary between medicine and fragrance blurred, and women adopted scented products not only to meet social expectations, but to follow medical advice. Perfume thus gained a legitimacy that shielded it from scrutiny, even when its ingredients carried risks. Doctors also misunderstood the connection between the environment and illness. They believed foul air caused disease, a concept rooted in miasma theory. Rather than targeting contaminated water or poor sanitation, they aimed to purify the air itself. Scented oils and perfumed vapors became part of this strategy. People burned aromatic herbs, infused their rooms with fragrant smoke, and sprinkled floral waters onto fabrics. These rituals created the illusion of protection without addressing the true sources of danger. Women responsible for maintaining domestic spaces adopted these practices diligently. The result was a household environment saturated with scent. Each room carried its own aroma: lavender in the bedroom, rosewater in the sitting room, bergamot in the hall. These fragrances masked odors from unwashed bodies, unlaundered garments, and stagnant air. They also gave families a sense of security, persuading them that they were taking responsible measures to protect their health. In truth, the scents did little but obscure the problems they were meant to solve. Women following doctors' instructions internalized the belief that managing ambience mattered as much as managing the body. They learned to rely on fragrance, not only for social acceptance, but for emotional and medical reassurance. This reliance deepened as physicians continued to endorse scented remedies while cautioning against physical cleansing. Perfume became intertwined with care itself, a symbol of caution, propriety, and health. These misguided ideas shaped how women understood their own bodies. They were taught that fragility was an inherent part of femininity, that risk lay in exertion or change, and that comfort could be achieved through scent rather than physical maintenance. Bathing became a rare event. Fragrance became a daily ritual. The body, treated with suspicion and fear, receded behind layers of fabric and perfume. Over time, these medical narratives solidified into cultural truths. Doctors, households, and social norms reinforced one another, creating a loop of belief difficult to unravel. Women found themselves navigating advice designed to protect them, but ultimately restricting their autonomy. Fragrance continued to fill the spaces left by uncertain science, performing the work that hygiene could not yet accomplish. These distorted medical beliefs strengthened society's dependence on fragrance, allowing perfume to replace practices that might have truly supported health. Yet amid these misunderstandings, another adaptation emerged, one that sought cleanliness without water, through powders and scented dust. Efforts to redefine bathing would soon take an unexpected turn, reshaping how women approached their bodies entirely. Dry bathing emerged quietly, not as a new invention, but as a practical adjustment to the constant limitations surrounding Victorian hygiene. In a world where water was scarce, bathing was inconvenient, and medical advice discouraged full immersion, people turned to methods that avoided the risks and demands of washing altogether. Wiping the body with a damp cloth, dusting the skin with powders, and refreshing garments with scented starch became substitutes for a bath. These practices formed a ritual that felt cleansing even when little actually changed beneath the surface. A damp cloth, warmed by hand or left cool depending on preference, served as the primary tool. Women wiped the face, necks, and hands gently, believing this minimal contact with water preserved their strength while removing the worst of the day's residue. This gesture offered a sense of renewal without requiring a full wash. It allowed women to say they had tended to their hygiene while avoiding the medical and social anxieties that surrounded bathing. The skin rarely grew fully wet, and the cloth absorbed little more than surface dust, yet the action carried psychological weight. Powder completed the process. Once the skin was blotted, Women sprinkled scented powders across their bodies, letting the fine dust settle into folds of fabric and pores alike. These powders absorbed sweat, softened the appearance of the skin, and left behind a gentle fragrance that suggested cleanliness. The powders clung to the body in ways water never did, persistent, dry, and deceptively reassuring. Their scent rose throughout the day, subtly reinforcing the impression of hygiene. Beneath the powder, however, sweat remained trapped, and dirt accumulated gradually. For many, the powders felt safer than water. Physicians encouraged their use, praising their ability to regulate moisture and calm the nerves. Women learned to keep small containers near their dressing tables, applying powder each morning as steadily as they applied perfume. The two rituals blended into one fragrance, layered upon fragrance, each cloud masking the absence of genuine cleansing. Over time, the scent of these powders became the scent of daily life itself. Clothing played a role in sustaining this shift. Heavy garments discouraged activity, and heat regulation, trapping perspiration while preventing evaporation. In cold seasons, removing layers to bathe exposed the body to discomfort or risk. Dry bathing offered a compromise. A woman could maintain the illusion of personal care without stripping down or exposing herself to cold water. Her clothing remained largely in place, undisturbed by the routine. This convenience reinforced the practice, making dry bathing the most practical option for many households. Dry bathing also suited environments where privacy was limited. In crowded homes, boarding houses, and shared living spaces, the opportunity for a full bath did not always exist. A quiet wipe down behind a curtain or next to a small basin required little water, little time, and little exposure. Women, accustomed to modesty, appreciated these constraints. Social pressure demanded discretion. Dry bathing provided it effortlessly. A woman could be considered presentable with nothing more than a cloth and a handful of powder. Despite its popularity, the method concealed deeper issues. Powder settled into pores, forming a residue that mixed with sweat and oils, creating a layer that was never fully removed. Over time, this buildup irritated the skin, trapped odors, and contributed to infections. But in an era where illness had many causes and few reliable explanations, these effects were rarely linked to hygiene. Discomfort and redness were blamed on fabric temperature or constitution, rather than the powders themselves. The ritual persisted. For working women, dry bathing was often the only option available. Long hours, limited water access, and inadequate facilities made full washing impossible. They relied on powders to manage the odors and discomfort that came from physical labor. Their skin bore the weight of the day beneath a thin veil of fragrance, a delicate compromise that allowed them to meet societal expectations with the few resources they had. Dry bathing also carried symbolic significance. It represented a middle ground between the dangers people feared from water and the pressures they felt to maintain a pleasant appearance. It fit the Victorian belief that the body needed protection rather than cleansing. Scented powders promised comfort, safety, and compliance with social norms without challenging the limitations of daily life. The body remained largely untouched, concealed beneath ritual rather than transformed by it. The technique expanded beyond the body into clothing and bedding. People sprinkled powder between layers of fabric onto pillowcases and inside gloves. The fine dust seeped into every corner of domestic life, leaving behind a faint haze that smelled of lavender violet or bergamot. This scent became associated not only with personal care, but with domestic respectability. A well-kept home smelled powdered. A well-kept woman did too. Over time, the line between cleanliness and concealment blurred entirely. Dry bathing did not remove dirt, it hid it. It created an aromatic surface that suggested purity, even as the truth lay buried beneath layers of powder and fabric. Women adapted to this ambiguity, accepting that the realities of their environment made true cleanliness difficult. Dry bathing became less a choice and more a necessity shaped by circumstance and reinforced by cultural belief. As the practice spread, its shortcomings deepened. The buildup of powders, residues, and perfumes created problems that could not always be ignored, such as itching skin, persistent odors, and fabric stained with the history of unwashed days. Yet the structure of Victorian life allowed these issues to fade into the background. The small discomforts of daily routine were simply absorbed into the broader struggle of enduring a world with limits everywhere. This reliance on dry bathing revealed how far women were willing to go to balance safety, modesty, and social expectations in an environment hostile to true hygiene. Yet even these improvised rituals could not protect them from challenges unique to their own bodies. Challenges that demanded concealment even more urgently. New burdens emerged each month, shaping another chapter in the story of fragrance and necessity. In an age marked by recurring waves of illness and uncertainty, households clung to whatever offered a sense of safety, and fragrance gradually evolved into something far more powerful than a pleasant indulgence. Epidemics appeared without warning, sweeping through neighborhoods already strained by poor sanitation and overcrowded living conditions. Medical knowledge remained fragile and often contradictory, leaving families desperate for protection in a world where the source of danger could not be seen, predicted, or fully understood. Into this atmosphere stepped perfume, quietly reshaping itself from a cosmetic luxury into what many believed was a form of invisible medicine. People embraced the idea that certain scents could ward off disease. According to the widespread belief in miasma, the notion that foul air caused illness, anything sweet-smelling or floral had the power to purify the atmosphere. If bad smells were dangerous, then pleasant ones must be protective. Lavender bundles hung near windows. Rosemary and mint were tucked into clothing. Bottles of rosewater sat beside beds, ready to be breathed in whenever fear tightened the chest. Families moved through their homes, surrounded by scent, as though fragrance could build a barrier against the world outside. During outbreaks of influenza, cholera, and other deadly illnesses, people inhaled perfumes with a kind of ritual devotion. Mothers dabbed scented waters onto children's pillows in hopes of creating a pocket of safety while they slept. Travelers carried small vials of aromatic oils close to their noses as they walked through crowded streets, believing each breath of fragrance filtered out harmful air. Markets sold pomanders filled with herbs and oils worn like talismans to guard against sickness. Perfume was no longer merely applied. It was defended, trusted, and used as a tool of survival. Manufacturers reinforced these beliefs through bold claims. Advertisements praised floral extracts for strengthening the nerves, clearing the lungs, or sharpening the mind. Some insisted that inhaling particular scents prevented colds or halted the progression of fever. There were no regulations, no chemical standards, and no scientific testing to challenge these assertions. Instead, people accepted the promises because they aligned with what they feared, what they hoped, and what they could control. Even physicians contributed to the confusion. Still, guided by incomplete theories, they often recommended aromatic vapors to soothe coughing, ease headaches, or calm anxious dispositions. A patient struggling to breathe might be instructed to inhale steam, infused with herbs or floral essences. Fragrance was prescribed as comfort, if not a cure. And for households longing for reassurance that comfort carried profound emotional weight, the appeal of scented protection made sense in environments where true safety remained out of reach. Clean water was unreliable, sewage systems were inadequate, and medical responses were inconsistent at best. Families could do little to prevent contaminated water from flowing into their homes or overcrowded neighbors from carrying illness through shared streets. But they could perfume a room. They could open a bottle and inhale. They could create the feeling of control in a world that gave them very little. Fragrance became a form of emotional medicine. When illness tightened its grip around a household, scent softened panic. A lavender-soaked handkerchief brought calm to a mother caring for a feverish child. A few drops of bergamot on the wrist offered a moment of steadiness in nights filled with uncertainty. People breathed in these comforting aromas, not because they cured anything, but because they made fear feel quieter. Public behavior shifted in response. During sickness outbreaks, people avoided alleys and districts where unpleasant odors lingered, believing disease hovered in the air. Flower sellers found themselves surrounded by crowds seeking safety disguised as beauty. Churches burned fragrant oils during services, hoping to shield congregants with rising plumes of scented air. Entire communities began to equate aroma with purity, danger with smell, and health with the absence of unpleasant odors. Women carried the heaviest responsibility in maintaining these rituals. They perfumed linens, garments, and rooms. They replenished sachets hung inside wardrobes. They refreshed handkerchiefs before stepping outside. Their daily labor kept fragrance circulating throughout the home, turning scent into a constant companion. Whether they fully believed in its protective power or simply clung to the reassurance it offered, fragrance became woven into their understanding of care. Over time, perfume settled into the borderland between medicine and ritual. A bottle of lavender oil might sit beside a jar of ointment on the same bedside table. Powder scented with violet might be used both for comfort and for beauty. The distinction between curing and calming blurred, replaced by a belief that fragrance shaped health in ways neither body nor mind could fully articulate. Scent concealed the fears no one dared name and offered a quiet illusion of control. The tragedy lay in the gap between belief and reality. Disease did not drift through the air because of foul smells. It spread through contaminated water, poor hygiene, and environments burdened by overcrowding. But this knowledge had not yet taken root. People clung to fragrance not because it worked, but because it gave meaning to their efforts to protect themselves. And in a time of fragile understanding, meaning often mattered more than truth. This trust in scent as a shield revealed how deeply people depended on small comforts when confronted with danger they could not comprehend. Yet beyond medical fears, another force continued to shape daily life, one that encouraged neglect of bathing not from caution but from acceptance. Growing cultural support for avoiding water would soon turn fragrance into a sanctioned replacement for cleansing. Public encouragement not to bathe did not appear abruptly. It emerged quietly, threaded through articles, advertisements, and domestic advice, until it felt not only acceptable but practical. In a society where water was unreliable, clothing burdensome, and medical guidance contradictory, the idea of avoiding baths altogether carried a strange sense of logic. What began as an adaptation slowly transformed into a sanctioned routine, one supported by voices that shaped women's daily lives far more than physicians ever could. Women's magazines became one of the strongest sources of this encouragement. These publications, filled with household recommendations and standards of propriety, often offered suggestions on how to maintain freshness without touching water. Advice columns reassured readers that wiping the face and hands, refreshing clothing with scented sachets, and applying generous amounts of perfume were sufficient to remain respectable. Some articles even warned that bathing too often could weaken the body, echoing lingering medical fears. What mattered most was not hygiene but appearance, and these magazines helped enshrine that belief. The tone of such guidance was gentle, almost comforting, presenting avoidance as an act of self-preservation rather than neglect. Readers were encouraged to focus on fragrance, modesty, and careful management of scent rather than the discomfort or inconvenience associated with bathing. Women adhered to these suggestions not because they lacked desire for cleanliness, but because the printed authority of magazines made such routines feel validated. These pages shaped habits and justified practices already made difficult by circumstance. Shops responded to this culture by offering products tailored to those who bathed infrequently. Among them were scented oils, powders, and perfumes, marketed specifically to individuals who wished to stay fragrant without washing. Some sellers even used humorous labels: perfume for the lazy, or essence for staying fresh without water, to normalize the idea further. The labels softened the truth behind the practice, turning necessity into a clever solution. These products sold well, their affordability and convenience making them fixtures in dressing tables across bustling cities and cramped industrial towns. This shift in commerce reflected a genuine understanding of women's constraints. For many, bathing required more than desire. It required access to warm water, privacy assistance, and time. The products advertised as effortless alternatives filled a gap created by social, economic, and environmental limitations. They allowed women to participate in routines expected of them while bypassing obstacles they could not overcome. The shops, however, rarely acknowledged the hardships that fueled these purchases. Instead, they leaned into humor, implying that choosing scent over water was not only functional but fashionable. As these messages spread, social attitudes shifted accordingly. People no longer scrutinized whether someone bathed regularly. They paid attention only to whether she smelled pleasant. A woman who carried the soft aroma of violets or rosewater was considered respectable regardless of what lay beneath her clothing. Meanwhile, one who emitted even the slightest trace of perspiration risked gossip and quiet judgment. Scent became both shield and currency, offering protection from criticism while concealing the lack of water-based hygiene no one discussed openly. This new standard created an environment in which not bathing drew no particular comment. It even became a kind of neutral default. Few households had the resources to bathe often, yet fragrance allowed them to maintain the illusion of propriety. Women who powdered their skin and perfumed their clothing could move through social spaces without fear of reproach. The absence of bathing became invisible as long as scent remained present. In this way, fragrance not only masked the body, but it also masked cultural discomfort with the realities of hygiene. The acceptance of infrequent bathing also reflected broader contradictions within society. People valued virtue, restraint, and modesty, yet imposed expectations that made true cleanliness nearly impossible. They praised a woman for smelling, delicate and composed, then ignored the structural inequalities that prevented her from caring for her body. They complimented the floral scent she wore, without recognizing that it was not chosen freely, but adopted out of necessity. Behind every fragrant woman stood the silent truth. Cleanliness, in a physical sense, had become a privilege rather than a norm. Even in wealthier households, bathing remained rare. The difficulty of laundering clothing, the weight of heavy fabrics, and the inconvenience of preparing warm water influenced behavior across class lines. Fragrance equalized these challenges, offering a universal method of maintaining social appearance. Wealthy women had access to finer perfumes, but both rich and poor relied on scent for the same reason: to navigate expectations that ignored the practical realities of maintaining the body. This cultural acceptance hardened into expectation. Women now had permission not to bathe, but only under one condition: they must remain fragrant. Fragrance became the measure of respectability. Its absence, rather than the absence of bathing, signaled neglect. Thus, the permission to skip baths did not free women from pressure. It created a new form of obligation. A woman who smelled fresh earned approval, but one who carried the natural odor of her own body, no matter the reason, risked being labeled careless, improper, or unrefined. This dependency on scent revealed a deeper societal truth. Cleanliness had ceased to be a physical practice and had transformed into a performance. The air around a woman became as important as the clothing she wore. Her scent conveyed discipline, morality, and control qualities demanded of her regardless of what resources she actually possessed. The fragrance did not cleanse her skin, yet it cleansed her reputation. This normalization of fragrance over bathing exposed a society more invested in appearances than in the realities of women's lives. Yet, as these habits grew stronger, another deeply personal challenge emerged, one that made dependence on scent even more urgent. Monthly discomfort and secrecy would soon force women to rely on fragrance in ways far more intimate than before. Menstruation arrived each month with a quiet weight that Victorian women carried largely alone. There were no sanitary pads, no disposable products, no medical guidance offering comfort or clarity. Instead, women relied on layers of cloth that were difficult to wash, slow to dry, and often uncomfortable. These makeshift protections absorbed little and revealed much, leaving women constantly aware of the risk of staining their garments or drawing attention to the natural functions of their bodies. In a society obsessed with modesty, this vulnerability created a fear far deeper than physical discomfort. Bathing during menstruation became an even greater challenge. The cloths used as protection absorbed blood that dried quickly, clinging to the body and becoming difficult to remove without warm water and privacy, two luxuries many households lacked. Heavy skirts and corsets restricted movement, making it nearly impossible for women to adjust or clean themselves without undressing completely. Privacy was rare, water was limited, and warmth was unreliable. Women had little choice but to endure discomfort, silently carrying its weight beneath layers of clothing. The pressure to appear composed added another burden. Society expected women to remain graceful, delicate, and fragrant, even when their bodies demanded rest. The physical strain of menstrual cramps, fatigue, and discomfort collided with the social expectation to move gently, speak softly, and show no sign of distress. To display any struggle was to risk being seen as weak, unstable, or improper. Women learned to mask pain with controlled expression, adopting stillness to conceal the tension of their muscles and the effort required simply to endure the day. Odor created another layer of anxiety. The clothes used for protection were rarely washed properly, sometimes rinsed but often reused without thorough cleaning. As they absorbed blood, sweat, and the natural odors of the body, women became acutely aware of the possibility that someone might notice a scent they could not fully control. The fear of being judged harshly for something both natural and unavoidable shaped their movements, their posture, and their social presence. It shaped their silence as well. Perfume intervened as a fragile form of relief. Women applied scent to their wrists, necklines, and even the linings of their skirts to mask odors they feared others might detect. The fragrance offered reassurance, even if temporary, a sense that the air around them projected composure rather than the physical struggle beneath their clothing. Just as it did in all other parts of Victorian hygiene, Perfume replaced what water and privacy could not provide. It was not a cure, but it softened panic, creating the illusion of control. For many women, fragrance became an emotional necessity during menstruation. The scent calmed the mind, creating a buffer between the body's demands and the expectations of society. A few drops of lavender on a handkerchief served as both mask and comfort, inhaled quietly during moments of pain. The routine of applying perfume provided structure to days that felt unpredictable. It was a ritual of steadiness, in a time when their bodies felt anything but steady. Yet the need for concealment extended beyond scent. Women feared any visible sign of menstruation, stained cloth, a faint mark on a chair, or a moment of discomfort that lingered on their face. Such signs could provoke gossip, ridicule, or moral judgment. Menstruation was not merely seen as unclean, it was considered improper, an intrusion of the private body into public life. Women were expected to behave as though it did not exist. Fragrance, in its subtlety, became one of the few tools available to maintain this illusion. Working women faced the harshest challenges. They labored long hours in factories, shops, and streets, where breaks were limited and privacy non-existent. The coarse fabric of their clothing absorbed sweat and blood quickly, and adjusting their clothes during the day was nearly impossible. Without access to clean water or private spaces, they endured discomfort that grew as the hours passed. Perfume, cheap and readily available, was their only means of maintaining social acceptability in conditions that denied them dignity. Even wealthier women with better access to water and private rooms struggled with the constraints of their garments. Corsets tightened against the abdomen, worsening cramps. Layers of petticoats weighed heavily, pressing against the body. Despite their advantages, they too relied on perfume to project an image of calm. No class was free from the expectations that menstruation must remain invisible. This silence surrounding menstruation reinforced its burden. Women could not speak openly about their discomfort, could not ask for accommodations, and rarely received empathy. The cultural expectation to remain fragrant and composed forced them to reframe their own experiences, not as moments for rest and care, but as tests of discipline. They learned to measure their value by how well they concealed something entirely natural. The disconnect between body and expectation widened with each month. Women internalized the belief that their bodies required constant management, that their natural rhythms were obstacles to propriety. Perfume, though comforting, deepened this divide. It offered a veil but not relief, hiding the truth while leaving its weight unchanged. The scent of flowers on the skin became a quiet symbol of endurance rather than indulgence. Over time, this reliance on fragrance shaped how women understood their own physicality. They associated their bodies not with strength or health, but with inconvenience, something to be masked, controlled, and made socially acceptable. Menstruation, rather than a cycle of renewal, became a monthly negotiation between bodily need and societal demand. Perfume softened the edges of that negotiation, but it did not erase it. This unspoken struggle made fragrance essential, not out of vanity, but out of survival, offering women a fragile sense of dignity when their bodies left them most exposed. Yet beyond these monthly hardships lay another habit of concealment, one rooted in powders, oils, and scented dust. Efforts to replace water entirely would soon deepen dependence on perfume in ways that touched every corner of daily life. Dry cleansing became one of the most quietly accepted practices of Victorian daily life, especially for women who lacked regular access to warm water or private bathing spaces. After wiping the body with a damp cloth, an act considered sufficient by many standards of the time, women reached for powders that promised freshness, dryness, and above all, discretion. These powders, often made from talc or other finely milled minerals, softened the skin while masking the scent of sweat that lingered beneath their heavy layers of clothing. It was a ritual repeated slowly, almost mechanically, for it formed part of an unspoken system of hygiene, built entirely around avoidance rather than cleansing. Talc powders clung to the skin in pale layers, absorbing moisture from areas where sweat gathered most easily. Women applied it to the neck, under the arms, across the chest, and even between folds of fabric where skin met tightly bound clothing. The powder created a thin film that reduced friction and stifled odor, allowing women to move with a semblance of composure despite the heat constraint and pressure surrounding their bodies. In a world where physical comfort was rarely prioritized, powder offered a fragile substitute for the relief that a proper bath might have provided. Some powders were scented lightly, infused with essential oils extracted from flowers, herbs, or resins. These were favored by many women because they added not just dryness but fragrance. Subtle at first, then deepening as the powder warmed against the skin. Lavender remained a popular choice, believed to calm the nerves. Rose added a softness, considered feminine and refined. Jasmine, though stronger, appealed to women who desired a scent that lingered long after they dressed. The fragrance blended with the powder's dry texture, forming a veil that masked natural odors without drawing too much attention. For women who lived in crowded neighborhoods, where access to clean water was scarce and shared facilities were unreliable, these powders became essential. Bathrooms were often communal, cold and uncomfortable, making them unsuitable for frequent bathing. Powdering the body, however, could be done quietly in one's room, requiring only a cloth, a tin of powder, and a few minutes of privacy. The ease of this routine made it deeply integrated into everyday life. It offered a sense of control, however small, over a world that made basic cleanliness impractical. Even in wealthier households, powder held a firm place. Servants prepared dressing rooms by setting out soft cloths, brushes, and small jars of powder with perfumes chosen by the lady of the house. After removing her evening gown or day dress, she might stand before the mirror, while her maid dusted powder across her shoulders and back. The act reinforced class divisions: one body, maintaining dryness through powder, another pair of hands performing the labor. Yet despite their privileges, even affluent women often relied on powders rather than baths, constrained by the density of their clothing and the cultural discomfort surrounding full immersion in water. The powders also served a practical purpose in managing the heavy fabrics of Victorian clothing. Corsets pressed the body tightly, creating warm areas where sweat accumulated quickly. Petticoats, chemises, and layers of skirts trapped heat and moisture, becoming uncomfortable over time. Powder reduced the stickiness and chafing caused by these garments, helping women maintain the appearance of elegance. It was not comfort they sought. It was endurance wrapped in dignity. Women working outside the home found powder even more essential. Factory floors, marketplaces, and long domestic shifts left little room for rest or self-care. In such conditions, powder acted as a small defense against heat and odor. A quick application before work could make the difference between tolerable discomfort and complete suffocation beneath rough clothing. For these women, powder was not an accessory, but a necessity born from circumstance. Scented powders also played a role in social interactions. A faint fragrance carried by powder suggested cleanliness, even when true cleanliness was difficult to achieve. In crowded rooms, ballrooms, parlors, and shops, women moved through the air, conscious of the impressions they created. A pleasant scent implied discipline, refinement, and self-control. In contrast, the slightest hint of sweat might provoke judgment. Powders allowed women to meet these expectations without revealing the effort required to maintain the illusion. Yet powder brought its own complications. Talc particles filled the air during application, settling on surfaces and often entering the lungs. Some powders contained additives that irritated the skin, leaving rashes or dryness that women quietly endured. Still, they continued to use them. The fear of appearing unclean outweighed the discomfort caused by the powders themselves. This patterned sacrifice, in the name of propriety, echoed through nearly every aspect of Victorian hygiene. The jars of powder that lined shelves and dressing tables became symbols of a society unwilling to confront the reality of bodily needs. Instead of encouraging better bathing facilities, more accessible water, or healthier clothing practices, the culture rewarded concealment. Powder fit neatly into that expectation. It was discreet, fragrant, and invisible beneath the garments worn daily. It replaced water without challenging the norms that made water so inaccessible. Over time, the routine became so ingrained that many women considered powdering not merely an alternative to bathing, but a preferable method. It required less vulnerability, less exposure, and fewer questions. Powder transformed cleanliness into something performative rather than physical. A thin, fragrant coating that projected acceptability while leaving the body's reality untouched. The powder tin, small and elegant, hid a deeper truth. Women were navigating a world that demanded grace while denying them comfort. Each dusting was both an adaptation and a resignation, a sign of resourcefulness shaped by necessity. This reliance on dry powders created a fragile facade of cleanliness, one built on fragrance and texture rather than water or true relief. Yet behind this facade lay beliefs about health that shaped every decision women made regarding their bodies. Whispers of medical advice would soon deepen these habits in ways not easily undone. Winter shaped daily life in ways that went far beyond the simple need for warmth. For many Victorian women, the cold season defined their relationship with water itself. Bathing, already difficult under normal circumstances, became something close to punishment when the air turned sharp and the nights stretched endlessly. Homes lacked the steady heat that might have made bathing manageable. Without central heating, every room sat in a still, heavy chill, and water, when poured into a basin, felt like a shock against the skin. The simple act of undressing was unpleasant enough. The thought of exposing the body to icy water made bathing nearly unthinkable. In small houses, frost gathered on window panes, and the air inside never fully warmed. Families relied on small fireplaces that heated only the immediate space around them. Venture a few steps away, and the temperature dropped sharply. To bathe meant stepping into the coldest parts of the home, where water sat untouched until needed, and where the air bit at the skin. Women hesitated, weighing discomfort against duty, and more often than not chose to remain dressed. Their clothing, heavy and layered, became both shield and trap, protecting them from the cold, but making true cleanliness difficult to maintain. Even in larger homes with more resources, warmth was inconsistent. Fires took time to build, and fuel was expensive. Households rationed coal, choosing to heat common rooms rather than bathrooms or dressing areas. A woman preparing to bathe might find herself standing beside a basin of water chilled to the bone, her breath visible in front of her. The cold pressed against her limbs as she moved, and every drop of water felt like a sting. In such conditions, bathing was not refreshing. It was an ordeal. Women developed strategies to avoid the worst of the cold. Some warmed cloths by the fire and pressed them briefly to the skin before wiping down. Others relied heavily on powders and perfumes to create the illusion of cleanliness without enduring the shock of cold water. These methods did not cleanse the body fully, but they made life bearable. Every choice was a negotiation between comfort, propriety, and the constraints of the environment. Clothing made the situation even more complicated. Victorian fashion demanded layers, chemises, corsets, petticoats, and thick skirts. Removing them took time and often required assistance. In winter, the loss of these layers meant losing the heat they trapped. Once undressed, a woman became vulnerable to the cold that seeped through walls and floorboards. Redressing after a bath was just as difficult, with chilled fingers struggling to fasten buttons and tie laces. The entire process discouraged frequent bathing, making alternatives like scent and powder far more appealing. In working-class neighborhoods, the challenge was harsher. Water needed to be fetched, carried, or purchased. Heating it required fuel that many families could not afford. A warm bath became a luxury reserved for special occasions or necessary medical care. On ordinary days, wiping the body with a cloth or using scented powders stood in place of a full bath. Women learned to conserve warmth, wrapping themselves tightly and keeping their bodies as dry as possible. Public bathhouses existed, but they were not always welcoming. The buildings were cold, the water inconsistent, and the environment uncomfortable. Women risked illness simply by being exposed to the damp, unheated spaces. Many preferred to avoid these facilities, entirely accepting the limitations of their homes, rather than enduring a place that offered little comfort in return. Fear played a role as well. Cold water was believed to weaken the body, particularly for women. Medical advice of the time often warned against bathing during winter or when fatigued, suggesting it could cause illness or even death. Such beliefs reinforced avoidance. Women protected themselves not only from the discomfort of cold, but from what they understood as real danger. Choosing not to bathe felt like a reasonable decision shaped by both environment and caution. The climate also affected daily routines. During long winters, daylight was limited, and homes remained dim for much of the day. Bathing in low light within a cold room added to the sense of hardship. Women adjusted their schedules, often delaying or avoiding any task that required removing clothing. Hygiene therefore became a matter of survival rather than self-care. Even small details contributed to the larger reluctance. Towels took longer to dry in winter, leaving them damp and unpleasant. Basins cracked from repeated exposure to cold water. The floors were icy against bare feet. Every part of the bathing process became a reminder that the home was not built to support the comfort of its inhabitants. These physical obstacles reinforced habits that leaned toward minimal contact with water. Perfume, once considered an enhancement, transformed into a coping mechanism. A few drops on the wrists, a dab behind the ears, or a gentle mist across the neck offered a sense of control. Scent became a barrier, protective, socially acceptable, and far less punishing than cold water. Women perfumed themselves through the winter, maintaining their dignity while avoiding the physical cost of bathing. The climate did not simply discourage bathing, it shaped an entire hygiene culture. Women adapted because they had no choice. They found alternatives because survival required it. And through repetition, these habits became expectations woven into Victorian identity. The cold seasons pushed women toward routines that masked discomfort with fragrance, creating a world where scent replaced warmth and cleanliness. These practices blurred into belief, making the avoidance of water seem almost reasonable. Beneath these choices, a deeper misunderstanding of health waited to steer women even further from true hygiene. Fragrance occupied a peculiar space in Victorian society, especially for women who faced strict rules about how they should present themselves. Physical beauty was permitted, but only within narrow boundaries. Any hint of boldness risked judgment, yet subtle allure was quietly encouraged as long as it remained hidden beneath layers of propriety. In this environment, scent emerged as one of the few acceptable tools a woman could use to express desire or to invite it without crossing into scandal. A fragrance drifting gently from her clothing or skin allowed her to be noticed but never accused. The body itself, however, was not allowed such freedom. To expose too much skin, even in private settings, could be taken as a sign of indecency. Bathing, which required undressing and acknowledging one's physical form, was therefore treated with suspicion. A woman seen preparing for a bath risked whispers about impropriety, while a woman who relied on perfume to maintain her composure was praised for modesty. Cleanliness was judged less by truth and more by appearances, and scent achieved what water often could not: public approval. The idea of fragrance as a form of indirect invitation fit neatly into the social structure of the time. A woman was never to appear forward, yet she was expected to attract attention in the right moments. Scent allowed her to walk this line with remarkable precision. A faint trail of perfume as she passed through a doorway suggested elegance, gentleness, and self-control. It also signaled something else, an awareness of her presence and how it affected others. Men noticed even if they never spoke of it. Women learned to master this small, powerful gesture. Layers of clothing added to the effect. Heavy fabrics, corsets, and petticoats trapped warmth and movement, but they also held scent. A woman who walked through a ballroom carried with her a hidden reservoir of fragrance that released itself slowly, like a message unfolding without words. The scent clung to her gloves, her sleeves, the space behind her collar. It softened the rigidity of her posture, giving an impression of intimacy without breaking any rules. No gesture violated decorum. No expression pushed too far. Fragrance did the work for her. People talked openly about the charm of a woman who smelled pleasant. They commented on delicacy, cleanliness, and refinement. These compliments, though superficial, allowed attraction to exist without direct acknowledgement. A man could admire a woman's scent without appearing improper, while a woman could heighten her presence without being accused of flirtation. The balance was fragile, but fragrance maintained it. Because bathing remained difficult, the reliance on perfume grew deeper. A woman who used scent well could mask the physical realities of her life. The sweat trapped beneath layers of clothing, the fatigue of long days, the discomfort caused by corsets that pressed against her ribs. Scent transformed these realities into something softer, something easier to bear. The fragrance became a second self, a version of her body that society allowed her to show. Even if the water never touched her skin, the scent made her acceptable. Perfume also carried symbolic meaning. Certain floral notes were linked to innocence, modesty, or genteel femininity. A woman who wore them communicated virtues that might not have aligned with her true feelings. This mismatch was rarely discussed, but widely understood. Scent allowed a woman to step into a role without speaking a word. It was a performance, subtle but constant, woven into daily life, in ways that shaped both perception and identity. In gatherings, the contrast between spoken rules and silent gestures became even clearer. A woman could not openly pursue attention, yet she might place a drop of fragrance at the base of her throat or behind her ear. These small decisions created tiny currents of notice within a room, pulling certain eyes toward her without breaking any visible boundary. The fragrance spoke in a language that society pretended not to understand. The idea that scent could invite desire more safely than revealing skin reflected deeper anxieties about control. The body, when exposed, was seen as dangerous, too honest, too vulnerable, too easily judged. Scent, however, offered a controlled release of intimacy. It reached people without requiring the woman to step forward. She remained shielded by her clothing, her posture, and her manners, but the fragrance allowed her to extend beyond them. For some women, fragrance became a tool of quiet resistance. If they could not move freely or speak boldly, they could still shape the air around them. They could claim a space in the room, not through voice or gesture, but through scent alone. It was one of the few ways they could exert influence without consequences. The softness of the method made the act invisible, yet its impact lingered. Society rewarded this subtlety. A woman who used scent well was admired, while one who revealed desire too plainly was condemned. The tension between these expectations created a world where perfume became essential. It was not only about masking odor or appearing refined, but it was also about navigating a system that allowed no direct expression of physical longing. Scent became the acceptable answer to a forbidden impulse. Fragrance offered women a quiet bridge between restraint and desire, letting them express what rules forbade them from showing. This delicate dance between propriety and subtle invitation shaped how women existed within both private and public spaces. Beneath this balancing act waited another truth: how daily life forced them to conceal struggles that reached far beyond attraction. Women of that era lived in a world that encouraged them to tend to their scent with far more devotion than to the bodies beneath it. Their skin might remain untouched by warm water for weeks, yet their dresses carried carefully layered fragrances, meant to mask every hint of fatigue or discomfort. The perfume did not simply rest on their clothing. It became a kind of armor, thin but persistent, shielding them from judgment in a society that allowed little room for physical imperfection. The body hidden beneath fabric and expectation faded into something secondary, something seldom acknowledged, except when it faltered. Inside many homes, a woman's presence was marked less by her footsteps than by the scent she left behind. The fragrance lingered on doorways, on chair cushions, on the fabric of curtains brushed in passing. People spoke of a woman's scent long after she withdrew from a room, as though the perfume itself were more memorable than her form or voice. This strange inversion made it easy for the body to disappear beneath the weight of its own representation. The fragrance held attention, the woman did not. It was common for rooms to carry a faint sweetness hours after gatherings ended. The scent did not belong to any one woman, but to the collective effort of all who had tried to make themselves acceptable. The air held lilies, violets, and roses, distilled into oils, powders, and tinctures, each chosen to project an image that often had little connection to the person wearing it. The perfume formed a separate identity, one that obeyed social rules more faithfully than the body ever could. While the real woman experienced soreness, sweat, and the strain of a tightly bound torso, the fragrance presented her as composed and effortless. This divide created a subtle pressure that shaped how women behaved within their homes as well as outside them. To smell pleasant was to be praised. To reveal a natural scent was to risk being seen as neglectful or coarse. Even within family settings, a woman was judged partly through the fragrance she carried. Perfume became a symbol of discipline, suggesting that she had managed herself correctly, even when her life was crowded with obligations. A stray note of perspiration suggested not human reality, but moral failing. Many women responded to this pressure by focusing more on maintaining fragrance than on maintaining physical comfort. They sprinkled scented powders across their skin, layered oils into their hair, and applied perfume to gloves, handkerchiefs, and undergarments. These actions created a cultivated aura that followed them everywhere. The body beneath these layers, unbathed, tired, sometimes ill, received far less attention. Water was scarce, time was limited, and bathing carried social risks. Scent did not. Visitors entering a home often noticed the fragrance before anything else. It told them that the household upheld propriety, even if the rooms were cramped or dim. In wealthier homes, the scent signaled refinement and control, reinforcing social status in subtle ways. In poorer homes, it provided a fragile illusion of respectability, masking hardships that lay just beneath the surface. Either way, the perfume spoke louder than the body. This dynamic extended to memory. People recalled how a woman smelled more easily than how she felt or moved. A particular floral note, a woody undertone, or a faint citrus trace could trigger recollections long after the details of her appearance faded. It was unsettling how quickly the mind attached significance to scent rather than substance. A woman might struggle with illness, exhaustion, or poverty, yet her fragrance crafted an image of serenity that others believed more readily than her lived reality. The perfume also outlasted emotions. Arguments, anxieties, and unspoken tensions dissipated, but the scent remained suspended in the air, as though waiting for the woman to return. It created a kind of ghost, gentle but persistent, reminding occupants of her ongoing duty to present herself acceptably. The body might bend under strain, but the fragrance remained upright, steady, and unchanged. It was the version of her that the world welcomed most. Over time, many women learned to see fragrance as a substitute for personal ease. If they could not rest, they could at least ensure they smelled pleasant. If they could not bathe regularly, they could at least control the impression they made. The aroma became a refuge, a way to maintain dignity in circumstances that allowed little space for genuine comfort. Yet this also meant that the real physical woman was often ignored or minimized. Her strain was hidden, her discomfort was denied, her scent carried more weight than her presence. Behind closed doors, the contrast grew sharper. A woman's body might ache from days spent standing, sewing, or cleaning, but her fragrance softened the perception of these efforts. She learned to manage how others experienced her without confronting how she experienced herself. The scent did not heal fatigue or relieve pain, but it erased them from view. Society accepted the fragrance as truth, even when it contradicted the body's own quiet warnings. Perfume became an extension of expectation, shaping how women moved through the world. In many ways, it was the only part of them that could travel freely. It slipped through crowded rooms, brushed past strangers, and told stories they could not safely speak. But the cost of this freedom was the gradual erasure of the body that produced it. The perfume remained vivid. The woman faded into the background of her own life. This devotion to fragrance allowed women to be noticed only through what they carried, not through who they were beneath it. Yet the more their scent defined them, the more their real bodies slipped into silence and neglect. Another layer of this contradiction waited within the beliefs that shaped their morality and their fears. Religious influence shaped many aspects of daily life, but its impact on cleanliness carried a particularly strong weight for women. The church encouraged modesty not only in appearance, but also in the treatment of the body itself. To engage too closely with one's physical form was seen as indulgent edging, dangerously close to vanity or sensuality. Bathing, which required undressing and acknowledging the body's needs, risked inviting suspicion. Women were taught that restraint was virtuous, and restraint extended even to the way they interacted with water. A woman who avoided bathing could be praised for humility, while one who sought physical comfort was quietly judged. These beliefs blended seamlessly with societal expectations. The idea that washing the body might encourage improper thoughts took hold in many households, making the act feel forbidden, even when it was necessary for health. Women learned that discomfort was a small price for maintaining moral purity. The church did not forbid bathing outright, but its teachings cast a shadow over the practice, encouraging women to limit it, especially when it required privacy or sensual contact with the skin. What should have been routine care became tangled in fear and guilt. The natural scent of the body, often unavoidable in daily life, was framed as a burden worth enduring. Religious teachings suggested that tolerating bodily odor demonstrated humility and discipline. Suffering quietly was seen as noble. Masking discomfort was considered a sign of inner strength. Women internalized these expectations, carrying them silently as they navigated environments where physical strain was constant. The belief that spiritual worth exceeded physical cleanliness simplified the matter for many, even as it demanded sacrifices from those expected to uphold it. Yet, this same moral framework allowed perfume to flourish. Unlike bathing, fragrance did not require exposing or acknowledging the body. It offered a way to present oneself acceptably, without violating principles of modesty. Perfume became a moral shield, a way for women to meet societal expectations without crossing the boundaries set by religious doctrine. It concealed the complexities of the human body, while allowing the woman to appear refined, controlled, and obedient to social norms. No guilt accompanied its use. It required no intimacy with water, no touch, no exposure. The duality was striking. On one hand, the body was considered potentially sinful, untrustworthy, something that should remain hidden and largely unattended. On the other hand, the social world demanded pleasantness, grace, composure, and scent. Perfume resolved this contradiction by covering what religion discouraged women from addressing directly. A floral note across the wrist or behind the ear allowed them to inhabit a form of cleanliness acceptable to both secular and religious eyes. It became normal to smell better than one felt better than one lived. Many women viewed fragrance as an invisible garment, something they wore to maintain dignity in a system that limited their autonomy. It covered fatigue, concealed odor, and protected them from judgment. Within church gatherings where notions of purity and virtue were reinforced, the scent often became a quiet badge of respectability. Women sat through long services, their bodies weary under layers of fabric, while a delicate aroma was all that others noticed. The fragrance supported a spiritual image, even if the flesh beneath it remained unwashed and exhausted. This separation between appearance and reality deepened as moral teachings continued to shape daily routines. The suggestion that bathing might stir temptation lingered, encouraging women to avoid water except in necessary circumstances. Mothers passed these beliefs to daughters, teaching them to fear the consequences of indulging the senses. Cleanliness of the soul mattered more than cleanliness of the body, and many accepted this hierarchy without question. Perfume allowed them to maintain compliance while avoiding shame. In poorer communities, religious teachings carried even greater influence. Bathing facilities were scarce, water was expensive, and privacy was limited. The moral discouragement of bathing aligned easily with practical obstacles. Women who could not afford regular washing found relief in knowing that avoiding baths was considered virtuous rather than neglectful. Fragrance offered them a way to appear respectable, despite circumstances. A dab of scented oil, or a pinch of powder, could transform how they were perceived, even if their physical conditions remained unchanged. The relationship between scent and morality created a subtle but powerful shift. Tears, sweat, and effort marked a woman's daily life, yet none of it was meant to be visible or acknowledged. The fragrance she wore smoothed over these realities, implying serenity where there was fatigue, purity where there was strain. Her scent affirmed her virtue more loudly than her actions or her suffering. People remembered the fragrance she carried, not the labor she endured. Even within private spaces, the influence persisted. A woman preparing for church might spend more time applying fragrance than tending to her skin. She knew the expectations placed upon her and the silent judgments that followed those who failed to meet them. She also knew that perfume lasted longer in memory than any honest reflection of her body. The scent stayed behind long after the woman's footsteps faded down the aisle. It outlived conversation, emotion, and presence. It became the version of her that people carried with them, more real than reality itself. This moral framework preserved a quiet imbalance. The fragrance mattered, but the woman did not. Her body remained secondary, an afterthought beneath the demands of virtue and appearance. Perfume softened her edges, concealed her humanity, and reassured others that she was disciplined and proper. The beliefs that shaped these habits endured for generations, blurring the line between morality and denial. These teachings encouraged women to hide their physical needs beneath layers of expectation, allowing fragrance to carry the version of themselves society preferred. Yet, as the reliance on scent deepened, so too did the distance between their real lives and the image they were forced to maintain. Within that growing divide, another form of influence began to push fragrance into an even larger cultural role. Newspapers and advertisements played an unexpectedly powerful role in shaping how women understood cleanliness, refinement, and modern life. As industries expanded and literacy increased, printed material reached households that once relied solely on local gossip and tradition. In this new landscape, fragrance was elevated not merely as a convenience, but as a defining symbol of progress. The press described perfume in glowing language, calling it a triumph of science and civility, a gentle step toward a more sophisticated world. They framed scent as a mark of cultural advancement, something that separated the modern woman from the primitive habits of earlier generations. This message spread quickly. Newspapers published columns praising the elegance of scented products, often comparing them favorably to the roughness of traditional bathing. Bathing, once seen as a necessary discomfort, was now painted as outdated, too physical, too direct, too closely tied to the body itself. Writers suggested that water belonged to an older, crude era, while perfume represented refinement and subtlety. Women reading these pages encountered a world where fragrance carried moral, aesthetic, and social value far beyond its practical purpose. Advertisements strengthened this narrative with strategic imagery. They linked scent to virtues like purity, discipline, and emotional composure. A woman who used perfume was portrayed as forward-thinking, intelligent, and socially aware. Meanwhile, a woman who depended solely on bathing risked appearing unsophisticated or even careless. These messages were crafted carefully, blending aspiration with pressure. Perfume manufacturers understood that desire could be shaped through suggestion, and they used the language of modernity to plant their influence deep into everyday thinking. Many ads promised more than a pleasant scent. They offered transformation. Women were told that fragrance could secure affection, elevate their social standing, or create opportunities otherwise out of reach. Success stories described how perfumes attracted romantic attention or opened paths to financial independence. These claims were rarely questioned. The desire for improvement, combined with the constraints placed on women's public roles, made perfume an appealing tool. It performed silently, yet its effects were portrayed as powerful and immediate. Bathing, by contrast, became associated with the physical labor that polite society preferred to ignore. Advertisements referred to it as unnecessary exertion, something that belonged to the less refined. Some even portrayed water-based cleaning as vaguely dangerous, hinting at old superstitions, while also aligning with modern concerns about cold temperatures and health. The body became secondary to the impression it gave, and fragrance offered a way to maintain that impression with minimal effort. The shift was subtle, but effective cleanliness was no longer defined by physical reality, but by the scent carried into a room. In this climate, perfume gained the status of a cultural necessity. Women who wished to appear respectable were encouraged to purchase scented oils, powders, and sprays, many of them marketed specifically to those anxious about their place in society. The advertisements spoke directly to their insecurities, suggesting that failure to use fragrance might result in social embarrassment or lost opportunities. As these messages accumulated, fragrance became intertwined with self-worth. A woman who lacked access to perfume could begin to doubt her adequacy, even when her living conditions made regular bathing nearly impossible. The press also contributed to normalizing questionable ingredients. Dangerous substances like lead and arsenic appeared in perfume-related products without warning labels, yet advertisements framed them as luxurious enhancements. The allure of modernity masked the danger. Women trusted what was printed, believing that products labeled refined or civilized must be safe. The disconnect between perception and reality grew wider, allowing industries to expand rapidly with minimal scrutiny. It became common for women to place their trust in bottles and powders, whose contents they never questioned. In wealthier circles, fragrance advertisements reinforced class boundaries. Perfume was depicted as a hallmark of cultured living, something that distinguished refined households from those still tied to manual labor. Fragrance implied leisure, education, and sensitivity. Women who embraced these products were portrayed as graceful and modern, while those who did not were implicitly linked to the roughness of older traditions. The press rarely articulated these judgments openly, but their imagery and language made the message unmistakable. Even in modest homes, families clipped perfume ads and kept them in drawers or pinned them to small corners of the wall. They represented aspiration, a glimpse of a life that seemed gentler and brighter than the one they knew. For many women, using perfume felt like participating in a world they could not fully reach. The scent became a bridge between what they had and what they hoped for. It softened the reality of cramped rooms, heavy clothing, and unending tasks. Inhaling fragrance allowed them for a moment to imagine a different life. This wave of promotional messaging also erased the body in subtle ways. Perfume ads never acknowledged the physical hardships women faced or the lack of bathing facilities. Instead, they focused on transforming scent into an identity marker. The body could be ignored, denied, or neglected, as long as its fragrance remained pleasant. This idea seeped into cultural norms, shaping expectations for generations. By the time newspapers and advertisements had fully saturated, society fragrance had become more than a product. It was a narrative, a story about who a woman should be, how she should feel, and how she should present herself to the world. Bathing had no place in this story. These messages reshaped public perception, convincing women that fragrance signaled advancement while bathing signaled backwardness. Yet behind the shine of printed promises lay struggles too ordinary for newspapers to mention. Hidden beneath these layers of scent and aspiration waited the final truth about how memory preserved what the body was never allowed to keep. A quiet truth begins to emerge. Once one looks closely at what fragrance truly represented in Victorian life, it was never a luxury. It was a plea wrapped in sweetness. Perfume shimmered in public memory, but in daily reality, it functioned as a thin, trembling shield, used by women who had very few acceptable ways to care for themselves. A bottle of scent was less an ornament than a quiet form of self-protection, something to soften judgment in a society that demanded refinement while denying women the means to maintain their own bodies. Every drop they applied was a small negotiation with the world, a promise to appear composed, even when their bodies were exhausted, unwashed, or strained beneath layers of fabric. Their bodies had already been marginalized long before fragrance entered the conversation. Victorian women lived within a lattice of restrictions, social, religious, moral, and domestic. Their movements were constrained by clothing, their behaviors limited by expectation, and their physical needs dismissed as unimportant or even improper. Bathing required privacy, warmth, and comfort, three things many women did not possess. Even when they did, the act itself carried moral suspicion. A woman attentive to her own skin risked accusations of vanity or impropriety. As a result, the body became something to quiet, something to hide beneath discipline and fabric, something rarely acknowledged except in illness. Fragrance stepped into that silence with remarkable ease. A single scent could mask hours of labor, disguise the stale air trapped beneath heavy garments, and create the illusion of serenity, even as the woman wearing it fought fatigue. Society welcomed this illusion because it required so little effort from anyone except the women themselves. People preferred the floral notes drifting through parlors and corridors. They did not want the truth of sweat restriction or discomfort. Perfume maintained appearances, and appearances mattered far more than health. Across households, the presence of a woman was often remembered through the trace of fragrance she left behind. The scent lingered on fabric, on door frames, on the cushions of chairs long after she rose from them. It became a kind of spectral version of her, gentler, quieter, easier to admire. Her body, meanwhile, remained unseen beneath layers of expectation. People praised the fragrance, not the woman who bore the burden of producing it. Memory favored the mask. This transformation was subtle but powerful. As fragrance took on a life of its own, the woman's physical existence became increasingly irrelevant. Her exhaustion, her discomfort, her hunger, her illness, all could be softened or erased by the correct application of perfume. Women began to tend more carefully to their scent than to their bodies because the world rewarded the former and ignored the latter. Society did not want the truth of their lives. It wanted the aroma that made everything seem orderly. In private, the contrast grew sharper. Many women slept in the same garments they worked in, unable to wash them more than a few times a season. They tended fires, scrubbed floors, sewed garments for their families, cared for children, and walked through soot-filled streets, all without the relief of a warm bath. Their skin cracked, their muscles ached, and their lungs carried the residue of urban air. Yet a few drops of perfume could, at least to others, suggest that everything was fine. It was the scent, not the woman, that shaped the narrative others believed. Even in rooms emptied of people, fragrance remained floating gently above the absence. In some homes, the smell of a departed woman lingered for months, clinging to shawls, gloves, letters, or hair ribbons stored away. Families often spoke of these lingering traces with tenderness, unaware that the memory they cherished came not from the woman herself, but from the mask she had been compelled to wear. The scent outlasted the struggle. The perfume endured, the body did not. This is the quiet tragedy embedded within Victorian womanhood. The fragrance survived more vividly than the flesh. A woman's body was disciplined, overlooked and burdened, yet her scent was praised, remembered, and sometimes even idealized. The disconnect was profound. What the world noticed was not the person, but the trace she left behind. Her effort to conform to expectations became a permanent echo in the air. Understanding this reveals the darker meaning of perfume in that era. It was not used to seduce. It was not used to indulge. It was used to hide what society refused to accept: a body in need of care. The sweetness of fragrance concealed lives, defined by restriction. It allowed women to move through a world that scrutinized them relentlessly without offering genuine support. Perfume granted them a fragile shield, but at the cost of their own physical acknowledgement. Every layer of scent was a compromise. Every trace of fragrance left in a room was a reminder of what they were allowed to display and what they were required to suppress. In the end, the scent became the most visible part of their identity, even though it was the least human. And when all else faded, when the corsets loosened, the candles burned low, and the day's labor settled into aching limbs, the fragrance remained suspended in the air, soft and persistent. It whispered of a life lived under rules that never saw the woman behind them. It carried her presence farther than her own voice could travel. It lingered as a gentle echo after everything else disappeared. Tonight, as you let your mind slow and the world around you quiets, imagine those faint traces drifting through dim Victorian halls. Soft at first, then settling like a memory that refuses to vanish. Let the air grow calm. Let the last thread of their borrowed sweetness dissolve into the dark, and allow yourself to rest in the stillness that follows. Good night. May your sleep be gentle, your thoughts unburdened, and your dreams kinder than the histories we have walked through together.